1923. Fall asleep to Hilarious History, The Trillion-Mark Loaf, and The Midnight Oath, in the narrative style of Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. Harding's Final Room Service. It is a curious thing, is it not, how the grandest of ambitions are so often laid low by the most pedestrian of circumstances? We observe men of great stature, or at the very least men of great girth, who stride across the stage of history with the gravity of Caesar, only to be tripped up by a piece of string or a bit of bad fish. History, that grand and dusty librarian, is rarely interested in the nobility of a man's last thoughts. She is far more concerned with the vulgarity of his last meal. Consider, if you will, the case of President Warren G. Harding. Here was a man who possessed the kind of face that belonged on a commemorative coin, or perhaps on a particularly handsome jar of pickles. He was a gentleman of the old school, a man who believed that the business of America was not merely business but poker, whiskey, and the occasional cigar smoked behind closed doors. He had arrived in the White House with all the fanfare of a brass band at a funeral, and he departed it with all the mystery of a man who has vanished into a magician's hat, never to be seen again, at least not in the sense of being upright and functional. In the summer of 1923, President Harding decided it was high time for a voyage of understanding. One might wonder what he hoped to understand in the frozen, sparsely populated expanse of Alaska that he had not already mastered in the smoke-filled rooms of Washington. Perhaps he believed that the cold air would sharpen his wits, or that the sight of an occasional polar bear might provide a necessary distraction from the persistent, buzzing anxiety of his own cabinet. He traveled with a retinue large enough to repopulate a small principality, moving through the West with the heavy rhythmic thrum of a train engine that knows it is going somewhere, though it isn't entirely sure why. The journey was a blur of speeches and handshakes, the perennial chores of the politician, which he performed with the practiced grace of a man who knows he is being watched, but wishes he were being ignored. He kissed babies, though one suspects he would have preferred to kiss a stiff drink. He spoke of progress and prosperity, though the air in Washington was growing decidedly thick with the stench of oil, specifically that of the naval reserves, which seemed to be leaking into the pockets of his dearest friends with a lubricated efficiency that bordered on the artistic. But it was in San Francisco where the narrative took a turn toward the inexplicable. The president, feeling distinctly under the weather, a condition that in those days was often attributed to everything from ptomaine poisoning to an excess of political virtue, checked into the Palace Hotel. Now, a hotel room in San Francisco is a place where one expects to find a comfortable bed, a view of the bay, and perhaps a bellhop who will look the other way when you order a bottle of something that hasn't been legal since the Volstead Act became the bane of every gentleman's existence. It is not, however, a place where one expects to shuffle off this mortal coil with such deliberate, frustrating ambiguity. The doctors, bless their hearts, were as baffled as a cat in a bathtub. They spoke in hushed, clinical tones about apoplexy and cardiac exhaustion, words that sound grand enough to cover a multitude of sins. But the public, having learned through long and bitter experience that the truth is usually the last thing to emerge from a room guarded by men in suits, began to sharpen their imaginations. Conspiracy theories blossomed in the heat of the rumors like weeds in a neglected garden. Was it the shellfish? Was it the stress of a scandal that refused to remain buried? Or was it something else entirely, a sudden, violent divergence from the path of the status quo? We shall never know, and that, in truth, is the finest part of the tale. The Gilded Era, that glistening, over-varnished epoch where every man was either a millionaire or a pauper, and the lines between the two were as thin as a banknote printed in a German basement, came to a sudden, breathless halt. The poker game, which had been the true heartbeat of the administration, was folded. The chips were swept off the table, the lights were dimmed, the president lay still, and the world, ever impatient for the next act, began to look elsewhere. It is the tragedy of all great figures that they are never as important as they imagine themselves to be, even when they are busy dying in a hotel room. As for Mr. Harding, he had successfully vacated the chair, leaving behind a legacy that was, in the main, a giant question mark scrawled in expensive ink. And so, the curtains closed on the Harding administration with the quiet thud of a man hitting the floor, leaving the nation to wonder who would next take up the gavel. There is a peculiar comfort in knowing that even the most powerful seat in the land is merely a chair, and that when the occupant leaves, the chair remains cold and expectant, waiting for the next poor fellow to sit down and try his luck against the house. The game, as they say, must go on, even if the players are changing with a velocity that suggests the very floor of the country is tilting beneath our feet. One can only imagine the ghosts of previous occupants whispering in the rafters of the White House, watching with amusement as the new hand is dealt. But for the moment, all was silence, and the telegraph wires were beginning to hum with the news that would soon turn the country toward a man from Vermont, a man who, as fate would have it, possessed a vocabulary that made a Trappist monk look like a carnival barker. Chapter 2. Calvin Coolidge and the Kitchen Counter Sovereignty. It is a singular quirk of the American experiment that we entrust the helm of our great, creaking, and often overly ambitious ship of state to the man who happens to be standing nearby when the previous captain decides to vacate his post. It is a system of succession that relies less on grand deliberation and more on the vagaries of geography and the reliable function of the telegraph wire. In the case of Mr. Warren G. Harding, the vacancy occurred in San Francisco, which, for a man of presidential ambitions residing in the quiet, verdant hills of Vermont, might as well have been the moon. Enter Calvin Coolidge, a man who viewed language as a precious, non-renewable resource, something to be mined sparingly and spent only on the most dire of necessities. He was a man who, if he were forced to choose between a witty remark and a period of absolute silence, would choose the silence, polish it, and store it away for a rainy day. He was the antithesis of the typical politician, who usually resembles nothing so much as a leaking fountain of words, forever spraying syllables in every direction, hoping that if they generate enough volume, nobody will notice that they haven't actually said anything at all. Coolidge was at his father's farm in Plymouth Notch, a place so removed from the frenetic pulse of modern American life that the arrival of a newspaper was considered a significant event, usually requiring a celebration involving hard cider and perhaps a nap. It was the dead of night, 2:47 to be precise, that hour when the ghosts of one's past are most likely to show up and demand an explanation for one's life choices. The telephone rang. It was an intrusion of the most unrefined sort. a mechanical screech tearing through the tranquil dark of a Vermont farmhouse. One can picture the scene. The elder Coolidge, a man of simple habits and sturdy constitution, answering the call. The news was relayed with that peculiar frantic urgency that only officialdom can manufacture. The president was dead. The vice president, by the grace of the Constitution and the unfortunate timing of a San Francisco heart, was now the chief executive. There were no marble halls, no velvet cushions, no throngs of cheering sycophants clamoring for a glimpse of the new standard-bearer. There was only a kitchen, a room defined by the smell of dried herbs and the lingering memory of breakfast. And there, standing by the flickering, stuttering light of a kerosene lamp, was the machinery of the United States government. It is a scene that would have struck a European monarch as a comedy of the most grotesque proportions. The idea that a man could be imbued with the sovereign authority of a nation by his own father, a justice of the peace, in a room where one might otherwise be expected to strain the pasta. Calvin Coolidge did not weep. He did not deliver a stirring oration about the burdens of destiny or the heavy mantle of leadership. He did not promise to make the mountains move or to turn the rivers to wine. He simply stood there, a man of granite in a room of wood, and took the oath. He understood with that dry Yankee sensibility that is so rare in the halls of power that the business of government is not a performance. It is a job, and one that is rarely improved by adding flourishes of melodrama. By the light of that lamp, which hissed and sputtered as if it too were trying to get a word in edgewise, the transition was complete. The Republic had a new head, and he had already distinguished himself by being profoundly, impressively unbothered. It was a moment of profound, almost comedic simplicity. The weight of the world had shifted from the shoulders of a man who loved poker to the shoulders of a man who, by all accounts, preferred the company of his own thoughts, a company he found quite reasonably to be superior to that of most other people. As the news trickled out, slowly through the wires and across the printing presses of a nation that was already beginning to move with a speed that defied sanity, the public was left to ponder what exactly they had acquired. They had expected a spectacle. They had been conditioned to believe that a president must be a creature of charisma, a man who could command the attention of a stadium and leave them breathless with the sheer volume of his conviction. Instead, they had received a man who treated the presidency like a long, somewhat monotonous chore, which, if one is to be entirely honest, is precisely the sort of attitude that makes for a durable, if not particularly exciting, government. One wonders, in the quiet, reflective moments that haunt the small hours of the morning, if Coolidge felt the shift. Not the legal shift. That is a mere matter of ink and paper, the sort of thing that keeps lawyers in suits and tax collectors in business, but the atmospheric shift. To go from being a man who could walk down a street in Vermont without anyone bothering to check his pockets to being the man upon whose decisions 100 million lives might turn, that is a transition that would induce vertigo in a lesser man. Coolidge, however, merely tightened his tie and went back to his business. There is a lesson here, I think, for the aspiring leaders of our age, those who treat every opinion as a manifesto and every public appearance as a coronation. The lesson is that there is a vast, untapped power in being the man who knows when to say nothing. The world is full of noise. It is full of men who think they are the sun around which all other planets must obligingly orbit. a man who refuses to contribute to that noise, who stands in the flickering light of his own small private lamp and does what is required without asking for applause, is a man who possesses a quiet, dangerous sort of autonomy. He brought to Washington a style of governance that was as sparse as his vocabulary. If the Harding administration had been a chaotic, boisterous, and ultimately messy party, the Coolidge administration was the act of cleaning up the spilled punch and opening the windows to let the stale air out. He did not aim to change the world, he aimed to keep it running, which, in a world that is constantly trying to fly apart at the seams, is a task of no small difficulty. His brevity became his signature, a curious trait that the public found both infuriating and endearing. He was like a man who had realized that life is too short to be spent explaining yourself to people who aren't really listening anyway. When a woman at a dinner party once famously wagered that she could get him to say more than 2 words, he looked at her with a steady, unblinking gaze and said, "You lose." It was the ultimate, devastatingly efficient dismissal. It was the triumph of the pithy over the pretentious. And so we find ourselves at the beginning of this new, strangely muted era. The oil scandals of the previous administration would soon begin to bubble to the surface. As all things hidden in the dark eventually do, the investigations would begin, the ledgers would be scrutinized, and the politicians would be forced to account for their creative interpretations of public service. But throughout it all, there stood Coolidge, like a stoic sentinel at the edge of a stormy sea, refusing to be buffeted by the winds of scandal or the waves of hysteria. He was the kitchen counter president, the man who proved that you do not need the trappings of grandeur to hold the reins of power. You simply need to hold them, firmly and without complaint. As he looked out from that farmhouse, perhaps he already saw the decade stretching out before him. A roar of machines, a flood of jazz, the clinking of coins that would soon lose their value, and the relentless creeping shadows of a future he could not possibly have foreseen. But for that moment, there was only the lamp, the oath, and the silence. It was a good beginning. It was, perhaps, the only kind of beginning that could stand up to the absurdity of what was to come. One cannot help but admire the man, if only for his sheer stubborn insistence on being himself in a world that was already beginning to demand that everyone be someone else. Chapter 3. The Teapot Dome boils over. It is a well-established truth in the great laboratory of human governance that nothing clarifies the moral compass of a politician quite like the sudden discovery of a hidden pipe. Specifically, a pipe, or a series of them, that happens to be stuffed, quite literally, with the black, viscous lifeblood of the modern industrial engine. I speak, of course, of oil, that subterranean gold which has done more to ruin the reputations of men than the invention of the chorus girl or the discovery of the loaded deck. With Warren G. Harding safely tucked away beneath the sod, and Calvin Coolidge occupying the White House with all the animated excitement of a coat rack, the atmosphere in Washington began to undergo a distinct change. It is much like what happens in a kitchen when the cook has departed and the guests have finally stopped pretending to enjoy the lukewarm soup. Someone inevitably notices that the silverware has gone missing. In this instance, the silverware was nothing less than the United States naval oil reserves, set aside by a foresight that is as rare in government as an honest lobbyist. The Teapot Dome, a name that sounds like the title of a nursery rhyme, but in practice functioned like the slogan for a criminal enterprise, was a geological formation in Wyoming that possessed the misfortune of sitting atop a vast, untapped fortune. It was, in the eyes of the Department of the Interior, a wasted asset. Why let that oil sit in the ground, they reasoned, when it could be doing so much more for the comfort and well-being of a few well-connected gentlemen? It is a peculiar facet of the political animal that he looks upon a public resource and sees not a trust, but a personal piggy bank waiting for a hammer. The orchestrator of this grand, oily dance was one Albert Fall, a man whose ambition was exceeded only by his ability to maintain a straight face while dipping his hands into the public till. He had managed, through a process so convoluted it would make a corkscrew weep with envy, to convince the authorities that it would be a patriotic service to lease these reserves to his friends in the petroleum industry. It is the hallmark of the true scoundrel to cloak his larceny in the flag, as if the smell of a bribe might be masked by the scent of ozone and starch. Congress, usually as dormant as a hibernating bear in the middle of a blizzard, suddenly woke up. Perhaps they were motivated by a genuine desire for justice, or perhaps they were merely irritated that they hadn't been invited to the feast. Regardless, they began to crack open the ledger books, and what a magnificent messy sight it was. It is a profound irony that the men who shout the loudest about the virtues of free enterprise are often the very same men who cannot resist the temptation to rig the game the moment the lights go down. The hearings were a spectacle that would have made a Roman gladiator yawn, though for entirely different reasons. We watched, mesmerized, as senators and investigators picked through the financial entrails of the oil moguls. It was a parade of sheepish expressions, sudden bouts of amnesia, and a remarkable number of forgotten bank deposits. One by one, the luminaries of the Harding administration were summoned to explain why their personal bank accounts had suddenly ballooned with the grace of a pufferfish. Their explanations, as one might expect, were exercises in the kind of creative fiction that would shame a dime novelist. They claimed these were loans, though they were loans that never carried the burden of repayment. They were investments, though they were investments that miraculously never saw a decline in value. It was the comedy of the transparent lie, the sort of falsehood that is so patently obvious that it becomes an insult not merely to the intelligence of the public, but to the very concept of lying itself. A good lie, like a good suit, should at least be tailored to fit the circumstances. These were garments of such shoddy workmanship that they fell apart the moment they were inspected in broad daylight. The public, for its part, watched with a fascination that bordered on the religious. We are a people who love a good scandal, mostly because it reassures us that our leaders are just as venal, confused, and prone to temptation as the rest of us. It is the great equalizer. When a man in a frock coat is caught with his hand in the jar, he stops being a pillar of society and starts being a fellow traveler in the grand, chaotic pilgrimage of the human condition. We sat in our armchairs, clucking our tongues and shaking our heads, while secretly marveling at the audacity of it all. The oil companies, meanwhile, behaved with the delicate subtlety of a stampeding herd of buffalo. They had bought the policy, they had bought the access, and they were quite certain they had bought the outcome. They were, however, unprepared for the singular, stubborn tenacity of the committee chairman, who decided that the trail of money was a thread that, if pulled with enough vigor, might unravel the entire sweater of the administration, and pull they did. There were dramatic retreats to the border, frantic burning of documents, and a desperate reshuffling of assets that would have been impressive if it weren't so transparently criminal. It was a master class in how to act guilty while pretending to be the victim of a political witch hunt. The teapot did indeed boil over, and the steam it released was thick with the scent of corruption, greed, and a deep, abiding disdain for the very people who were supposedly being served. And yet, through the center of this hurricane sat the American taxpayer. We are a patient lot, long-suffering and surprisingly loyal to a fault. We tolerate the nonsense, we pay the taxes, and we endure the preposterous speeches, all with the vague, optimistic hope that the next man in the chair will be an improvement. We are like the child who is told that if he behaves, he will receive a pony, and who continues to wait, even as the horse barn is slowly converted into a private club for the town's wealthiest residents. The Teapot Dome scandal did not bring down the Republic, nor did it spark a revolution in the streets. We are far too pragmatic for that. Instead, it served as a grim, albeit highly entertaining reminder that the machinery of government is only as clean as the hands that operate it. It turned the spotlight on the fact that while we were busy debating the merits of the Volstead Act and wondering if the radio would ever amount to anything more than a toy for enthusiasts, the real work of the country, the buying and selling of influence, was proceeding with the relentless mechanical precision of a clock. It is a fascinating thing to observe a scandal unfold in real time. It has a beginning, a middle, and a resolution that feels almost scripted. The villains are unmasked, the reputations are scorched, and the public is left with a sense of moral superiority that usually lasts until the next scandal appears on the horizon. But in those moments when the truth is finally laid bare upon the table, one gets a rare, unfiltered glimpse into the engine room of history. You see the gears grinding against each other, the oil spilling out in dark, sticky puddles, and the desperate, frantic attempts of the operators to cover their tracks before the public catches on. As the smoke cleared, the Teapot Dome became more than just an oil field in Wyoming. It became a synonym for the hubris of an age that thought it could outrun the law. It proved that you can hide many things, your intentions, your allegiances, and your actual income, but you cannot hide the scent of crude oil when it is being peddled behind closed doors. The scandal served its purpose, reminding us all that if you're going to be a thief, you should at least have the good sense to be a quiet one. But then again, if you were that sensible, you probably wouldn't have gone into politics in the first place. And so, the ledger of history was marked with another entry of folly. The politicians returned to their offices, the lobbyists returned to their lunches, and the country turned its eyes to other matters, content to let the memory of the Teapot Dome fade into that vast, hazy collection of grievances that we keep in the attic of our national consciousness. We are an odd bunch, we Americans. We are deeply cynical about our leaders, yet we are perennially shocked when they behave exactly as we expect them to. It is the great, enduring contradiction of our existence, and perhaps, in its own way, it is the secret to our survival. We expect the worst, we laugh when we find it, and we keep on walking, confident that the next bridge we cross will be built by someone who is at least clever enough not to steal the supports. Chapter 4. The Trillion-Mark Loaf of Bread. It has been said by those who fancy themselves students of the dismal science that money is merely a medium of exchange, a social construct designed to lubricate the gears of human commerce. This is a comforting thought, provided you are the one holding the lubricant. But in the Germany of the early 1920s, money had ceased to be a tool. It had become a fever, a delirium, a frantic, flapping paper bird that had forgotten how to fly and was instead busy burning up in the atmosphere of its own sheer quantity. Imagine, if your constitution can handle it, a land where the printing presses have developed a personality of their own. They did not merely work, they galloped. They worked day and night, shift upon shift, with the tireless enthusiasm of a choir of angels, or perhaps more accurately, the frantic intensity of a man trying to bail out the Atlantic Ocean with a thimble. The Weimar Republic, having discovered the miracle of the printing press, decided that if a little money was a good thing, then a mountain of it must be a paradise on earth. They discovered, alas, that when you print money, until the paper becomes more common than confetti, the numbers on the bills grow so large they lose all meaning, eventually resembling the distance between stars rather than the cost of a ham sandwich. It was a time when the ink, in point of fact, became the only thing of intrinsic value. A man might walk into a bakery with a wheelbarrow full of currency, a sum that a few years prior could have purchased a respectable fleet of steamships, only to find that the price of a loaf of bread had, in the time it took him to walk from the bank, doubled. It is a peculiar sort of comedy to watch a nation attempt to purchase its lunch with a currency that loses value faster than a politician's promise in an election year. Children, those small, inventive creatures who can find entertainment in a puddle or a stick, discovered that the currency of the realm made for excellent building blocks. Why bother with wooden bricks when you have a treasury full of paper that is worth less than the glue holding it together? They built towers that scraped the ceilings of their tenements, fortresses of finance that were, in truth, the only stable thing in a country that had otherwise gone entirely mad. It was a grand, unintentional performance art. The state was busy creating millions of millionaires, all of whom were simultaneously discovering that being a millionaire is an empty distinction when you cannot afford a cup of coffee. The workers, poor souls, were reduced to a state of primitive bartering that would have made their ancestors, the ones who traded pelts for salt, feel right at home. They demanded to be paid twice a day. Why, you ask? Because the money they earned in the morning was frequently worth only a fraction of its value by the evening. The worker would receive his pay, dash to the nearest market like a man pursued by devils, and trade his paper fortunes for a scrap of cheese or a lump of coal before the clock struck noon and the money became little more than high-quality kindling. It was a frantic daily race against the depreciation of human labor. I once knew a man who boasted that he had retired with a pension that would have supported a small army. He was quite proud of himself until the day he went to buy a newspaper and found that his entire month's pension was not sufficient to cover the cost of a single copy of the Tageblatt. He stood there staring at the coin dispenser, a man of dignity and thrift, suddenly faced with the realization that the world he had spent his life preparing for had simply evaporated, replaced by a ghost world of zeros and decimals that didn't add up to a crust of bread. There is a grim, dark sort of humor in the spectacle of a country losing its grip on the very concept of value. People began to carry their money in suitcases, then in laundry baskets, and finally, for the truly prosperous, in wheelbarrows. It was not uncommon to see a gentleman pushing a cart overflowing with banknotes, looking for all the world like a man hauling scrap metal to the dump, which, in a sense, he was. One could not help but be reminded of the absurdity of the whole human endeavor, the way we tie our hopes, our futures, and our very survival to these flimsy, printed slips of paper, only to have them vanish into the ether when the wind blows the wrong way. The government, meanwhile, kept the presses clanking. They were like a captain who, finding his ship taking on water, decides that the best solution is to drill a few more holes to let the water out. The more they printed, the more the prices rose in a beautiful, terrifying spiral that defied every law of nature except, perhaps, the law of gravity. It was a race to the bottom, and by the saints, they were winning it with a speed that was truly breathtaking. One might ask, what were the people to do? They did what people have always done. They laughed, they told jokes about the money, they made paper hats out of 100,000-mark notes. They found ways to survive in the wreckage of their own economy, proving that human beings are, if nothing else, remarkably adaptable to the most ludicrous of circumstances. They learned that a half loaf of bread shared with a neighbor was worth more than a wheelbarrow full of paper that could be invalidated by a single government decree. And what of the ledger? Ah, the ledger. It was a casualty of the war, a casualty of the peace, and finally, a casualty of the sheer absurdity of the numbers. When you are dealing in trillions, the math becomes a matter of theology rather than economics. You stop measuring your wealth and start measuring your hallucinations. It is a state of grace, in a way, to be so poor that money becomes a triviality, a confetti to be tossed in the wind. But as with all things, the fever eventually breaks. The currency was one day swept away, replaced by something new, something with a firmer grounding in reality, leaving the millions of mark notes to serve as wallpaper, as fire starter, or as the scrap paper upon which the next generation would write their homework. It was a chapter in the history of the world that serves as a cautionary tale for any who think that the path to prosperity is paved with the ink of the printing press. It is a sobering thought, is it not? That all our pride, all our commerce, all our intricate systems of exchange can be rendered as meaningless as a child's game by the simple act of printing too many zeros. We build our kingdoms on foundations of paper, and we are surprised, astonished, even when the wind blows and the paper flies away. We are such simple, trusting creatures, forever believing that the numbers will stay where we put them, that the value will remain where we store it, and that the world will continue to make sense even when we have done everything in our power to ensure that it doesn't. But there is a certain peculiar freedom in the bankruptcy of a nation. When the illusion of wealth is stripped away, you are left with the people themselves, and that, perhaps, is the only thing that was ever real to begin with. It is a hard, cold, and uncomfortable truth, but it is one that the Germans of that era had to learn, 1 trillion-mark note at a time. It is a tale of woe, yes, but it is also a testament to the fact that even when the world goes mad, there is a stubborn, resilient part of the human spirit that refuses to be crushed by the weight of a worthless currency. And that, I suppose, is something worth writing about. Chapter 5. The Munich Beer Hall Interruption. There is, I have often observed, a distinct and unfortunate intersection between the consumption of fermented grain products and the formation of political ideologies. When a man has had enough of the local brew, his confidence tends to expand until it fills the room. His opinions become as sharp as a newly honed axe, and his sense of perspective shrinks until it could fit comfortably inside a thimble. Most men in this condition are content to shout their grievances at the moon or perhaps at an unfortunate stray dog. But every once in a long, weary while, a man arises who decides that his particular flavor of post-pint lunacy is, in fact, the blueprint for a new civilization. In the autumn of 1923, the city of Munich, a place generally more concerned with the quality of its pretzels than the direction of its government, played host to just such a man. He was an Austrian fellow, possessed of a haircut that looked as though it had been administered by a particularly unskilled gardener with a pair of rusty shears, and a voice that possessed all the melodic charm of a grinding gear. He had spent his early years failing at art, a pursuit in which he showed all the nuance of a sledgehammer, and had subsequently decided that if he could not paint the world as he wished it to be, he would simply tear it down and rebuild it with the raw materials of his own towering, unexamined rage. On a night that was otherwise unremarkable, save for the fact that the beer was cold and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of tobacco and stale optimism, this fellow decided to make his grand entrance. He burst into a beer hall, a place where people had gathered for the sole purpose of avoiding the complications of the real world, and proceeded to fire a pistol into the ceiling. It is a very effective way to get an audience, I must admit, though it is remarkably poor form as an opening act. The crowd, which had been perfectly content to argue about the rising price of rye bread, suddenly found itself being lectured on the destiny of the German people by a man who was vibrating with the intensity of a tuning fork that has just been struck by a mallet. The putsch, as he so grandiosely christened it, was meant to be the thunderclap that would shake the foundations of the Bavarian government. It was intended to be a revolution, a glorious uprising of the righteous against the corrupt, the beginning of a new era of national splendor. In reality, it was a display of organization so remarkably incompetent that it would have been laughed off the stage of any self-respecting vaudeville theater in the country. It lasted precisely as long as it took for the local constabulary to finish their own beers and decide that they really couldn't be bothered with this sort of nonsense. The police arrived, not with the gravity of an invading army, but with the weary patience of a school teacher breaking up a brawl in the back of the classroom. There was a bit of shouting, a bit of pushing, and before the smoke from the pistol shot had even cleared from the rafters, the revolutionary was being escorted to the door with the unceremonious haste of a man being tossed out of a saloon for failure to pay his tab. It was a failure of such exquisite proportions that one wonders if he realized even in his own fevered mind just how ridiculous he looked. But here is where the tragedy begins to shade into the truly grotesque. Rather than vanishing into the obscurity he so richly deserved, this man was carted off to prison, where he was given a desk, a supply of paper, and an indefinite amount of time to sit and nurse his delusions. It is a curious habit of the state to treat its most dangerous cranks with a level of hospitality that is, frankly, baffling. They did not put him to work cleaning the streets or mending fences. They allowed him to write a book. Now, a book is a dangerous thing. It is a vessel for ideas. And when you give a man with an obsession a way to codify that obsession into prose, you are doing something far more permanent than shooting a pistol into a ceiling. He wrote a long, rambling, and altogether tiresome volume, a work so heavy with self-pity and hatred that it should have required a permit to own. It was a manifesto of his own importance, a map of his own fractured psyche, written with the confidence of a man who believes that he is the only person on earth who has ever truly looked at the sun. While he sat in his cell, the world outside went on about its business. The currency continued its plummet into the abyss, the orchestras continued to play their jazz, and the people continued to wonder if the next decade would be a dance or a funeral. They did not notice the man in the cell. They did not see that while the beer hall interruption had been a failure, the act of writing that book had been a success of the most sinister sort. He was not merely recording his thoughts. He was sharpening them, honing them into a blade that would, in the fullness of time, be used to carve the heart out of the world. It is a sobering reflection on the nature of history. We are so often distracted by the loud events, the explosions, and the dramatic confrontations, that we fail to notice the quiet ones. The man sitting at the desk, the ink staining his fingers, the slow, steady transformation of madness into ideology. We like to think that history is made by the grand sweeping motions of armies, but often it is made by a single man in a quiet room, feeding his own bitterness until it becomes a fire large enough to consume a continent. The Munich beer hall was a comedy, yes. It had all the elements of a farce. The amateur actors, the over-the-top performance, the confused and disgruntled audience, and the inevitable slapstick conclusion. But the comedy ended when the pen hit the paper. When the dust of the putsch settled, the police went home. The beer hall was swept clean, and the world forgot about the little man with the bad haircut and the loud voice. But he did not forget about the world. He was busy, in the dark, weaving a web of such complexity and venom that it would take a world-shattering war to tear it apart. It is the lesson of all such figures, I suppose, that they are never truly defeated by the laughter of the crowd, for they have no capacity to hear it. They are insulated by the thick, impenetrable armor of their own certainty. We look back at these events now and wonder how it was possible that no one took him seriously, that no one saw the storm brewing in the teapot of his own ego. But that is the privilege of hindsight, which is always 20/20, though it is usually far too late to do anything about the tragedy that has already occurred. He would eventually leave his cell. He would step out into a world that was still recovering from the madness of the previous decade, a world that was tired, hungry, and looking for someone to blame for its own exhaustion. And he would be waiting with his book and his rage and his absolute unshakable conviction that he alone had the answer. The interruption in the beer hall was merely the dress rehearsal. The main performance was still to come, and the rest of the world, having failed to recognize the gravity of the clown, would be forced to play the role of the tragic audience. It is a heavy thought, and one that makes the present moment feel just a little bit colder, as if the shadow of that beer hall is still stretching across the decades, reaching out to touch the backs of those who think they are living in a time of peace, one can only hope that we learn to recognize the difference between a man who is merely loud and a man who is truly dangerous before the pistol is fired and the book is written. But I suspect, with a heavy heart, that humanity is a slow learner, and that we are destined to relive the same mistakes until we finally grow tired of the tragedy. Chapter 6. The Ruhr Occupation. Paying in Coal. It is a curious and melancholy fact of human nature that when a man finds himself unable to settle a debt with a gentleman, he does not generally offer to clean the gentleman's gutters or paint his fence. No, he offers excuses. He offers promises. He offers, if he is particularly desperate, a series of elaborate explanations as to why the debt is not actually his fault, but rather the result of a cosmic conspiracy orchestrated by his neighbors, the weather, and the inherent perfidy of the universe. The Weimar Republic, finding itself in the uncomfortable position of having squandered its wealth on a printing press that could not stop its own frantic clatter, had reached a point where it could no longer fulfill its reparations obligations to the victors of the Great War. France, a nation that had learned the hard way that promises are a poor substitute for cash, decided that it was finished with the art of negotiation. If Germany would not pay in marks, which, as we have observed, were currently being used by the local citizenry to paper their bathrooms and insulate their attics, then France would simply come and take the payment in a more tangible form. Coal. Thus, the French army, with all the grim brass-buttoned efficiency of a collection agent who has lost his sense of humor, marched into the Ruhr. The Ruhr was the industrial heartbeat of Germany, a land of soot, smoke, steel, and a great many men who spent their lives digging in the dark so that the rest of the world might have the light and the warmth to pursue their own varied and mostly pointless endeavors. The French intent was simple. They would occupy the mines, they would command the trains, and they would haul the coal back to France as a matter of course. It was a classic old-fashioned seizure of assets. The sort of thing that has been going on since the first caveman decided that his neighbor's pile of flint looked better in his own cave. But here is where the story takes a turn into the realm of the truly whimsical. The German government, having no army to speak of, for the victors of the war had seen to that with the thoroughness of a surgeon removing a gallstone, and no money to offer resistance, did something entirely novel. They told the workers of the Ruhr to stop working. It was a stroke of genius, or perhaps just a desperate, flailing move that happened to land on its feet. The German government called for a policy of passive resistance. They essentially told the French, "You want the coal? Come and get it. But you will find that the coal does not wish to be moved, the trains do not wish to run, and the machines have a sudden and profound desire for retirement." And so began the grandest, most stubborn, and most entirely stationary strike in the history of the industrial age. The French officers arrived at the mines, expecting to be greeted by the usual bustle of production, only to find the gates locked, the fires cold, and the workers standing around with their hands in their pockets, looking at the sky with the vacant, unbothered expression of a man waiting for a bus that he knows is never going to come. It is a spectacle of massive, deliberate uselessness. Imagine a French sergeant, stiff with military discipline and the righteousness of his country's claim, demanding that a German foreman fire up the boiler. The foreman, a man who has spent 40 years in the belly of the earth, looks at him with a slow, deliberate blink and says, "I would be happy to, my friend, but you see the shovel has gone on strike. It refused to be lifted this morning on account of its own back pain. The French were baffled. They had brought rifles, they had brought tanks, and they had brought the crushing authority of an occupying force. But how do you occupy a man who refuses to move? How do you command a machine that has forgotten how to start? How do you conquer a country that has decided, collectively, to sit down on the sidewalk and eat a sandwich until the problem goes away? The French tried to run the railroads themselves. They found that the tracks had a peculiar tendency to be blocked by precisely the sort of obstacles that appear when no one is looking. And the engineers they brought from home found that the German locomotives were a species of machine that only responded to the particular affectionate touch of a native operator. The whole enterprise turned into a surreal, slow-motion farce. The French were in control of the Ruhr, but they were in control of a giant, static museum of industrial machinery. They were occupying a graveyard of production. Meanwhile, the German workers were treated as heroes. They sat in their taverns, they sang their songs, and they watched the French officers march back and forth in the rain, looking increasingly frustrated and redundant. It was the invention of the profitable strike, if you can call it that. By doing nothing, they were costing the French a fortune in occupation costs, while the French were gaining nothing in return. Not a lump of coal, not a scrap of iron, not a single solitary thing to show for their trouble. It is a lesson in the power of the sedentary. We are taught from a young age that the one who moves the fastest wins the race, that the one who works the hardest reaps the reward, and that the one who takes the initiative commands the field. But the Ruhr occupation proved that, on occasion, the one who wins is the one who simply refuses to participate in the game altogether. It is a profound, anarchic, and utterly delightful realization. Of course, the costs were high. The workers were starving, the economy was in tatters, and the misery was spread across the land like a thick, gray fog. But there was a strange, grim pride in it. They were holding their ground by staying exactly where they were. They were the immovable objects against which the French were slowly, predictably, and quite humorously shattering their own sense of military superiority. One can almost sympathize with the French. They wanted their reparations, and they wanted a return on their investment in the blood and treasure of the Great War. But they found themselves in the position of a man trying to wrestle a shadow. Every time they thought they had a grasp on the situation simply evaporated, leaving them standing in the rain with their hands empty. It was a stalemate of the most intellectual sort. The French had the power, but they lacked the cooperation. The Germans had the misery, but they had the defiance. And in the middle of it all sat the stacks of coal deep in the earth, untouched, unmined, and entirely indifferent to the political squabbles of the creatures living on the surface. They were the true victors of the peace. They simply stayed where they were, waiting for a time when the world would be less concerned with the vanity of nations and more concerned with the simple, practical necessity of staying warm. As the months dragged on, the absurdity of the situation became clear to everyone. The French realized they were paying more to occupy the Ruhr than the coal was worth, and the Germans realized they could not stay idle forever without the entire nation simply coming to a halt. The profitable strike eventually gave way to a grudging compromise. But the point had been made. The world had learned that when you force a man to work, you might get his labor, but when you forbid a man from working, you have gained a far more potent weapon. It is a tale that reminds us that in the grand theater of history, the stage hands are just as important as the leading actors. When the workers stop moving, the play stops, no matter how much the director shouts or how much the producers demand their money. It is a simple, mechanical truth, but it is one that has caused more than its fair share of headaches for the would-be conquerors of this world. And for that, if for no other reason, it is a chapter that bears repeating, if only to ensure that we do not forget the power that lies in the simple, stubborn act of doing absolutely nothing at all. Chapter 7. The Hollywoodland Sign. There is, in the geography of human aspiration, a peculiar tendency to confuse a collection of wooden sticks with a manifestation of destiny. If one were to travel back to the dusty, sun-bleached hills above Los Angeles in the year 1923, one would find not a temple of culture nor a citadel of commerce, but a group of real estate speculators engaged in the most high-stakes game of pretend that the American West has ever seen. These gentlemen, operating with the frantic optimism of a prospector who has just caught the scent of gold in the wind, decided that what the hillside lacked was a bit of advertising. Not the subtle, tasteful sort of signage that suggests a fine establishment, mind you, but a declaration so absurdly, grotesquely large that it could be seen from a moving train, a horse-drawn carriage, or a particularly adventurous eagle. They decided to erect 13 giant letters, each one roughly the size of a 2-story house, to spell out a name that promised everything and delivered at the time absolutely nothing. Hollywoodland. It is a word that drips with the cloying sweetness of a half-forgotten candy bar. It was intended to signify a place of upscale living, a residential development for the kind of people who have more money than sense and a deep, abiding desire to live in a house that looks like a Mediterranean villa, but is situated on a slope so steep that it requires a mountain goat to collect the mail. The letters were made of wood, braced with wire, and painted white, with a determination that suggested they were expected to stand for the duration of the Republic. They were meant to stay up for 18 months. It was a temporary promotion, a flash in the pan, a bit of clever marketing that would be dismantled as soon as the last plot of land was sold to some wide-eyed dreamer from the East who believed that living on a hillside in California was the equivalent of a ticket to paradise. But history, that grand, ironic, and thoroughly mischievous librarian, has a way of deciding that the temporary shall be permanent, and the marketing shall become the monument. The sign grew old. The paint began to peel. The wood began to warp, and the letters began to lean with the weary indifference of a man who has stood too long at a bus stop. One of the D's fell down, leaving the word to look like a phonetic spelling for an ailment of the throat. Yet, despite the decay, the sign remained. It watched over the city as it began to change, as the quiet groves of fruit trees were replaced by the glittering, frantic, and entirely artificial industry of the moving picture. It is a grand irony, is it not, that a sign intended to sell suburban lots, houses with porches and sensible lawns, should become the permanent looming totem of a world built entirely on beautiful lies. The film industry, that sprawling, chaotic, and wonderfully mendacious enterprise, adopted the sign as its own. It became the skyline of the imagination. It was the lighthouse for every drifting, talented, and desperate soul who thought that, If they could just get to California, they might convince the world that they were something other than what they really were. Think of the desperation, the sheer unadulterated hubris required to look at a barren hill and say, "Yes, this is where we shall build our dream factory." The people who flocked to Los Angeles did not come to buy real estate in the Hollywoodland subdivision. They came to be seen. They came to trade their names, their histories, and their very identities for the promise of a flicker on a silver screen. They looked up at those giant wooden letters and saw not a real estate advertisement, but a promise of immortality. And the funny thing is, the sign did not care. It stood there, bleached by the sun shivering in the heat, watching the procession of hopefuls and failures, starlets and scoundrels, directors and drifters, all of whom were trying to build their own little empires in the shadow of 13 wooden blocks. It is a place where reality goes to die and fiction goes to be enshrined in the public heart. There is something profoundly, aggressively American about it. We are a nation that loves a billboard, that believes that if you shout the name of your ambition loud enough, it will eventually become true. And in Hollywood, it actually does. A man can arrive with nothing but a smile and a bad suit, and in the space of a few years, he can be a king, a god, a figure of global adoration. It is a fairy tale, but one that is manufactured in a room filled with cigarette smoke and loud, frantic men who are busy calculating the cost of a camera lens. The sign is the perfect symbol for it all. It is hollow. It is made of light wood and paint. From the back, it is nothing but scaffolding and wires. But from the front, in the right light, at the right distance, it is a legend. It is the gate to the promised land, even if the land is currently being sold at a loss by a group of men who are wondering if they should have just stuck to cattle ranching. We, as a people, are obsessed with the surface of things. We love the facade. We love the painted wood, the manicured lawn, the bright colors that promise that the world is a better place than it truly is. And in the 1920s, this obsession reached a fever pitch. We stopped looking at the houses and started looking at the dreams. We stopped caring about the reality of our lives and started caring about the narratives we could create about them. The sign stood for it all. It was the literal physical manifestation of our national desire to pretend. We built our lives in the shadow of it, and we never stopped to wonder if perhaps the whole thing was just a piece of plywood that had stayed up a few decades too long. But who needs reality when you have a monument to your own fantasies? Who needs to build a house on a stable foundation when you can build a career on a hillside under the watchful, peeling eye of a giant misspelled word? It is the great, enduring joke of the 20th century. We set out to build a residential development, and we ended up building a world. We set out to sell a plot of land, and we ended up selling the future. And as the decades rolled on, as the city expanded, as the groves of trees disappeared, and as the sign continued its slow, graceful descent into decrepitude, the world outside kept looking at it and seeing not a failing real estate development, but a destination. It is a lesson for the ages. Never underestimate the power of a really big, really public, and really misguided advertisement. If you stand it up in a place where people are prone to dreaming, it will eventually stop being an advertisement and start being a part of the landscape. And once it is a part of the landscape, it is immune to the truth. You can point out the rotting wood, you can point out the missing letters, you can point out that the whole thing is just a piece of commercial junk, and it will not matter. The dream is already built. The legend is already written. And the sign, the simple wooden sign, will continue to look out over the city of angels, forever silent, forever hollow, and forever undeniably a masterpiece of our own collective, charmingly absurd imagination. One can only hope that, when it finally does fall, we will have the sense to realize that the dream was never in the wood, but in the fact that we were ever foolish enough to believe in it at all. But I suspect we will simply build a new one, perhaps a little shinier, perhaps a little more expensive, and we will continue the show undeterred by the reality that we are all, in the end, just actors on a stage that was only supposed to stay up for 18 months. Chapter 8. The Mouse House Foundations. It is a curious thing to consider how the most monstrously overgrown enterprises often begin in the smallest and most pathetic of closets. One might expect an empire that will eventually dictate the morality of the world's nursery schools to be born in a palace, or perhaps in the back room of a bank. Instead, the great mouse house began in a dusty, sun-starved corner of a small office in Los Angeles, where the primary assets were a bottle of ink, a broken typewriter, and a pair of brothers whose main qualification for greatness was an inability to accept the fact that they were supposed to be failures. The Disney brothers, Walt and Roy, were not particularly worried about conquering the planet at the time. They were primarily concerned with keeping the lights from being turned off by an electric company that had very little interest in the artistic merits of animated cartoons. They were engaged in a peculiar sort of alchemy, taking a flat, lifeless piece of paper and trying to convince the viewer that it had the spark of the divine. It was a noble, if thoroughly unremunerative, pursuit. Now, consider the method. These pioneers of the flickering screen began by doing something that, to the sensible mind, is entirely backwards. They decided to mix the living with the dead, or rather, the breathing with the static. They would take a real live flesh and blood girl, a young lady of considerable patience and a limited number of facial expressions, and place her in a landscape inhabited entirely by ink-drawn monsters and dancing brooms. It is a terrifying concept, really, when you think about it. It is the sort of thing that a person might see in a fever dream after eating a particularly unwholesome portion of late-night sausage. They called these Alice comedies, and they featured a young woman interacting with cartoons. The girl would point at an empty space, and the animators would labor for weeks to make sure that a cartoon cat appeared in that space to receive a pat on the head. It was a masterpiece of tedious coordination, a way of proving that humanity would do absolutely anything to avoid the monotony of reality. The audiences, bless their hearts, were enchanted. They didn't care that the girl was talking to a wall. They wanted to believe in the cat. They wanted to believe that the wall was a door to somewhere else, somewhere brighter, somewhere where the laws of physics were merely suggestions that could be ignored by anyone with enough imagination. The brothers, in their infinite, desperate wisdom, did not realize that they were not merely producing a film. They were erecting a foundation. They were laying the bricks for an empire that would eventually own so many theaters, television stations, and theme parks that the mere mention of their name would induce a Pavlovian response in the average child. They were, in the parlance of the day, busy as a one-armed wallpaper hanger, which is a fine way to describe a man who is building a cathedral out of gossamer and ink. It is a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, truth that the most powerful entities in our society are the ones that have mastered the art of the illusion. The Mouse House did not start with political power or vast amounts of capital. It started with a drawing of a rabbit. It started with the realization that people are inherently dissatisfied with the world as it is, and that they will pay a nickel to anyone who can provide a temporary, high-quality substitute. The brothers were, quite frankly, out of their depth. They were constantly struggling to pay the rent, constantly looking over their shoulders for the creditor, and constantly trying to figure out how to make an ink-drawn mouse do something that wasn't entirely mortifying. They were human beings in the truest sense of the word, flawed, worried, ambitious, and entirely unaware that they were about to become the architects of a new mythology. They were just trying to get through the week without having to declare bankruptcy, which is, I suspect, the true secret behind every great corporation. There is a sort of cosmic irony in the fact that this empire of happiness was built upon a foundation of intense, soul-crushing anxiety. You look at those early films and you see the joy, the colors, the bounce in the step of the cartoon characters. You do not see the frantic, red-eyed animators hunched over their desks, fueled by nothing but black coffee and the terror of missing a deadline. You do not see the brothers pacing the floor, counting their remaining pennies and wondering if they should have taken that job at the grocery store. It is the great, enduring miracle of the American spirit, the ability to manufacture delight while standing on the brink of total ruin. It is a high-wire act that we perform every single day, and we are so good at it that we have convinced ourselves it is not a performance at all. We have convinced ourselves that the Mouse House, with its castles and its parades and its absolute refusal to acknowledge the existence of a gray day, is the true state of affairs, and that the rest of the world of bills and cold weather and the occasional inevitable disappointment, is the illusion. One cannot help but admire the audacity of it. To take a small office in Los Angeles, to take a few sheets of paper, and to declare that this is where the joy of the world shall reside, it is the height of hubris, and yet it worked. It worked because we wanted it to work. We needed a place to go when the world got too heavy, a place where the mouse is always the hero and the castle is always made of light. They were building a foundation, not just for an empire, but for a collective consciousness. They were teaching a generation to look at a screen and expect to be lifted out of their own lives. It is a powerful thing, that. It is a dangerous thing, too, because once you have been taught to expect paradise, you become increasingly dissatisfied with the earth. But that is the business of the entertainer, is it not? To keep you looking at the stage, even when the floor beneath you is starting to tremble. As the months passed, the studio grew. The characters became more complex. The stories became more elaborate. And the brothers began to see that they were no longer just making films. They were building an ecosystem. They were crafting a world where the rules were simple, the stakes were manageable, and the ending was always inevitably and comfortingly happy. They were, without realizing it, preparing the public for a future where the distinction between the real and the imagined would become so blurred that we would eventually stop trying to tell them apart. They were a long way from the small office, a long way from the rented cameras, and a long way from the fear of the dark. But in those early days, in the shadow of the Hollywood sign, they were doing the hard, grinding work that makes an empire possible. They were learning the language of the mouse. They were learning how to speak to the child that lives in the heart of every, even the most cynical man. They were, in their own small, frantic, and entirely human way, starting a fire that would eventually consume the world, one animated feature at a time. It is a story of grit, of luck, and of the most profound, stubborn kind of hope. And if in the end it becomes something more than that, something that reaches into the pockets of every citizen and demands a tithe for the privilege of the dream, well, that is the price we pay for wanting to live in a house that belongs to a mouse. We asked for the illusion, and we got it in spades, with a castle and a pair of white gloves to boot. One can only wonder what the brothers would make of it all now, the empire, the merchandise, the global reach. I suspect they would be terrified, or perhaps they would just reach for their pencils, realize they were out of ink, and start looking for a new place to build. Because that is what the mouse house does. It builds, it expands, it consumes, and it never ever stops to worry about where the money is coming from, so long as the light in the theater stays on. Chapter 9. The Warner Brothers Quartet. It is a curious truth of the cinematic age that the most enduring empires are often founded not by visionaries in velvet robes, but by four brothers who looked like they had just stepped off a third-class train, smelling of ambition and cheap tobacco, and who possessed the collective temperament of a pack of wild terriers. The Warner brothers, Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack, were from Poland, a land that has produced more than its fair share of geniuses, poets, and men who know exactly how to squeeze a nickel until it cries for mercy. They arrived in the land of opportunity with nothing but a projector, a dream, and a mutual agreement that if they were going to fail, they would do it loudly and in each other's company. They were a quartet, you see, and like any quartet, they spent a good deal of their time in a state of harmonious discord. Harry was the eldest and the most serious, a man who treated a ledger book with the reverence a priest might afford a holy relic. Albert was the diplomat, the man who smoothed the ruffled feathers that Harry spent the better part of his day ruffling. Sam was the dreamer, the one who looked at the horizon and saw not just a sunset, but a business opportunity, while Jack was the youngest, the most volatile, and the most determined to ensure that he was the only brother whose name appeared in the headlines. When they formally incorporated their studio in Los Angeles, they were not, as one might imagine, sitting on a throne of gold. They were sitting on a mountain of unpaid electric bills, wondering if the bank would notice that the check they had just written was backed by nothing more than the promise of a hit picture. They were the quintessential American immigrants. They had the hunger, they had the hustle, and they had a profound, deep-seated fear of being poor again. This is a powerful combination. It is the sort of thing that can turn a backyard tent into a global conglomerate, provided you don't mind sacrificing your dignity, your sleep, and the occasional holiday dinner for the sake of the box office. Their early days were, to put it mildly, a struggle. They were like four men trying to steer a ship across the Atlantic using nothing but a pair of oars and a very large, very uncooperative dog. And that, in fact, brings us to the most remarkable member of the Warner stable, a German shepherd by the name of Rin Tin Tin. Now, it is a grand, hilarious, and thoroughly American irony that the salvation of a group of Polish brothers in Hollywood was a dog who had been rescued from the trenches of the Great War. Rin Tin Tin was not your average canine. He was a creature of such dramatic presence, such startling intelligence, and such uncanny ability to look melancholic on command that he was, quite frankly, a better actor than most of the men who were currently walking the streets of Los Angeles. He was the secret weapon. While other studios were obsessing over the dramatic capabilities of their leading men, the Warners were betting everything on a dog who had never taken a lesson in his life but could outweep the finest tragedian in the business. The public, bless their simple, sentimental hearts, fell in love. They didn't care about the script, they didn't care about the plot, and they certainly didn't care about the technical quality of the film. They wanted to see the dog. They wanted to see Rin Tin Tin rescue the girl, save the day, and bark at the villain with the moral authority of a saint. The money began to flow in, and the Warner brothers, who had spent the better part of the year hiding from their landlords, suddenly found themselves in the position of being able to pay their bills, buy a new suit, and perhaps even invest in a lunch that consisted of more than just hope. The brothers, however, were not the sort of men to rest on their laurels or on the tail of a dog. They were always looking for the next angle. They were the ones who realized that if you wanted to change the world, you had to change the way the world heard it. They were the ones who, against the advice of every sane man in the industry, decided that the future of the cinema was not in the silence, but in the sound. It is a marvelous, beautiful, and entirely terrifying thing to watch a man bet his entire existence on a technology that hasn't quite decided if it wants to work yet. The sound systems of that day were temperamental, finicky, and prone to the sort of electronic tantrums that would make a sane man swear off progress forever. But the Warners were not sane men. They were brothers. They were entrepreneurs. They were, in their own way, the four horsemen of the talkie apocalypse. They moved forward with the determination of a bulldozer, ignoring the skeptics, the critics, and the terrified financiers who were certain that they were leading the industry over a cliff. And in a sense they were. They were leading it over a cliff into a brand new world. A world where the screen would finally find its voice, where the silence would be broken, and where the cinema would become a place of song, speech, and the occasional jarring sound of a door slamming shut. It is a tale that reminds us that the history of progress is rarely written by the people who were the most qualified to write it. It is written by the people who were the most desperate, the most stubborn, and the most willing to look like a fool in front of a room full of people who think they know better. The Warners didn't know how to build an empire. They just knew that they had to build something, or else they would be out on the street. One can almost see them, sitting in their office late at night, the four of them hunched over a flickering light, the dog asleep in the corner, the ledger spread out before them, and the sounds of the city of Los Angeles pulsing through the windows. They were not building a monument to themselves, though Jack would certainly try to ensure that their names were etched in stone before the night was out. They were building a machine, a giant, complex, and wildly profitable machine that would eventually feed the hunger of a global audience for stories, for laughter, and for that peculiar intoxicating feeling that comes from watching a dog save the world on a giant piece of white cloth. It is a human story, through and through. It is a story of brotherhood, of conflict, of the absolute necessity of keeping one's head when the world is telling you that you are making a mistake, and of the realization that sometimes the only thing standing between a man and obscurity is a very talented dog, and the courage to take a gamble that no one else is brave enough to take. They were the Warners, not heroes, not saints, but men who understood that if you want to make a mark on the world, you have to be willing to make a bit of noise while you're doing it. And in that, at least, they were and remain the absolute masters of the craft. As we look back on their beginnings, it is easy to see the path they traveled, but it is harder to understand the sheer grinding daily reality of it, the uncertainty, the arguments, the moments of despair, and the quiet, fierce, and entirely unstated love that held the quartet together through it all. They were a family, and like all families, they were a mess. But they were a mess that changed the way the world looked at itself. And really, what more can a man ask for than that? One can only hope that wherever they are now, they are finally in agreement on the ledger. The dog is happy, and the screen, for once, is silent. But I suspect they are still arguing, still looking for the next angle, and still, most importantly, trying to find a way to make sure that their names are the ones that appear in the headlines. They were the Warners, after all. They wouldn't have it any other way. Chapter 10. Time Magazine and the Weekly Condensed Reality. It is a well-observed phenomenon that the modern citizen is a creature of peculiar and conflicting appetites. He wishes to be informed, certainly. He wants to know which wars are currently being fought, which scandals are currently being concocted, and which distant nations have recently decided that their border belongs to their neighbor. However, the same citizen is possessed of an attention span that would make a hummingbird look like a scholar of the ancient scrolls. He is far too busy, you see. He is busy making money. He is busy spending money. He is busy pretending he has no time to read the long, tedious, and hopelessly complicated accounts of the daily news. Enter two gentlemen by the names of Britton Haddon and Henry Luce. These fellows were possessed of a singular, brilliant, and arguably dangerous epiphany. If the public is too lazy to read the news, then it is the duty of the enterprising man to pre-digest that news for them, to strip it of its complexity, and to present it in a form that can be consumed between the breakfast coffee and the morning commute. They set out to create Time Magazine, a publication designed specifically for the person who wants to feel as though they have grasped the entirety of human existence in the space of half an hour. It was a project of audacious simplification. They looked at the daily press, that vast, churning ocean of ink and opinion, and they decided to bottle it. They invented a vocabulary that was, in point of fact, a brand new dialect. It was a language of inverted sentences, of punchy adjectives, and of a tone that suggested the writer was a man who had seen everything, heard everything, and was entirely unimpressed by the whole spectacle. It was the tone of the all-knowing narrator, the man who speaks with the authority of the gods while sitting in a drafty office, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, and wondering if he can get the copy to the printer before the sun goes down. They decided, in a stroke of marketing genius that would have made P.T. Barnum weep with envy, to put a face on the cover every 7 days. Just one face. It didn't matter if it was a statesman, a scientist, a particularly successful criminal, or a woman who had managed to swim the English Channel without losing her hat. The face became the anchor. It became the symbol of the week. By looking at that face, the reader was granted the illusion of understanding. He could look at the cover of Time on a subway platform, nod to his fellow commuter with the sage gravity of a man who knows the secret history of the world, and feel perfectly secure in his own ignorance. It was, in effect, the birth of the condensed reality. It was the invention of a pamphlet that organized the chaos of the globe into neat, digestible packages. You had your national affairs, your foreign news, your business, and your science. It was a grocery store of human experience, organized on the shelves of a weekly publication so that you didn't have to wander through the aisles yourself. Why bother with the complexities of European politics when you could read a paragraph that explained it all with the breezy confidence of a bartender? Why struggle to understand the nuances of a new technological discovery when a writer could explain it to you in 3 sentences, accompanied by a picture that made it look slightly more important than it actually was? The magazine was a roaring success. It tapped into that most American of sensibilities, the desire to be in the know without the arduous, time-consuming labor of actually finding things out. It created a class of people who could carry on a conversation about the affairs of the world without ever having read a single primary source. It was, I must admit, a magnificent piece of engineering. Haddon and Luce were the architects of a new kind of intellectual minimalism, the high priests of the bottom line. But one cannot help but notice the hidden cost of such an endeavor. When you compress the world into a pamphlet, you do not just save time, you lose perspective. You trade the depth of the story for the punchiness of the sentence. You trade the complexity of the human condition for the caricature of the face on the cover. You begin to believe that the world is exactly as it is described in those glossy, well-ordered pages. You begin to believe that every conflict has a side, every politician has a character, and every global event has a simple explanation that can be typed up in the allotted space before the deadline. The writers, meanwhile, were churning out this time style with the mechanical precision of a sausage factory. They were trained to write in the same voice, to adopt the same attitude, and to present the same facade of omniscience. It was a stylistic uniform. No matter who wrote the article, it sounded as though it were being whispered in your ear by a very well-informed, somewhat cynical, and entirely anonymous ghost. It was a remarkable feat of literary homogenization. And yet, despite my natural curmudgeonly skepticism, I find myself somewhat dazzled by the audacity of the enterprise. Here was a publication that looked at the rapidly expanding, wildly confusing, and thoroughly terrifying 20th century, and decided that it could be tamed. It could be edited. It could be bound in paper and sold at a newsstand. It was a triumph of order over entropy. It was the human mind's desperate, frantic attempt to say, I see you, world, and I have categorized you, and I have put you in a drawer. It is a fine thing to have a drawer, I suppose, but one must be careful not to mistake the drawer for the world. When you spend your life reading only the condensed versions of events, you eventually lose the capacity to grapple with the sprawling, untidy truth of reality. You begin to crave the summary. You begin to find the full, messy, unedited experience of life to be tedious and confusing. You become a tourist in your own existence, observing the sights from the comfort of an air-conditioned bus, safely distanced from the grit and the grime of the actual terrain. Still, one cannot deny the influence of the venture. They turned the weekly news into a ritual. They gave the nation a common language, even if that language was somewhat artificial and designed specifically for the convenience of the busy man. They created a rhythm for the public consciousness, a 7-day cycle of curiosity and closure. It was the invention of the weekly pulse, and in a world that was already beginning to move much faster than any of us were prepared for, that pulse was, at the very least, a constant. One wonders if Britain Haddon and Henry Luce were to return today to look at the fragmented, screaming, and endlessly scrolling reality of our modern age, where the condensed reality is delivered in nanoseconds to a device in one's pocket. Would they be proud? Would they look at our current state of information saturation and see it as the logical, magnificent conclusion of their little pamphlet? Or would they be horrified to see that we have traded their polite, structured weekly summary for a chaotic, non-stop, and utterly unmanageable torrent of everything? I suspect they would be rather confused by the lack of a cover. The beauty of their creation was the face. The face was the promise that there was a person, a single human being, at the center of the week's news. Today, we have no center. We have no face. We have only the flow. We have the endless, churning, faceless sea of data that washes over us, and we are drowning in it, precisely because we have forgotten how to read anything that hasn't been pre-chewed for our comfort. But I digress, as is the habit of a man who has lived long enough to see the world try to fit itself into a box. Time magazine was a moment in the history of our curiosity, a moment when we decided that we wanted the truth, but only if it could be served on a platter. It was a clever, witty, and profoundly flawed attempt to manage the infinite. It is a chapter in our history that serves as a reminder that no matter how hard we try to organize the world into a neat weekly pamphlet, the world will always refuse to cooperate. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all, because as long as the world remains untidy, as long as it refuses to be summarized in a pithy paragraph, there is still a chance that we might actually be living in it, rather than just reading about it in a magazine. And that, I believe, is a conclusion worth holding on to, even as the clock ticks and the next issue, and the next, and the next, prepares to descend upon the newsstands. Chapter 11. The Cotton Club opens. In the grand rattling machinery of Harlem, that shimmering syncopated borough where the very air seems to be composed of saxophone reeds and ambition, there opened a night spot that was to become the most curious, the most glittering, and the most profoundly American paradox of the age. It was known as the Cotton Club, a name that evokes the humid, labor-heavy fields of the Deep South. Yet it was located in the heart of a northern metropolis, surrounded by tenements, subways, and a frantic modern energy that would have baffled a plantation owner of the previous century. It was a place where the finest black musicians in the world, men whose fingers danced over piano keys and brass valves with the grace of a gazelle, played the most sophisticated, high-stepping jazz for an audience that was, if the management had their way, entirely and exclusively white. It was, in short, a musical theater of the absurd, a gilded stage where the greatest talents of the Harlem Renaissance were showcased as if they were performing in a zoo for the amusement of those who, only a few blocks away, would not have dreamed of inviting the performers to tea. One stands back and contemplates this arrangement and finds oneself reaching for the smelling salts. It was a glittering musical paradox wrapped in the chilling ice of prohibition. The city was dry, officially speaking, though it was actually as wet as a sponge left out in a monsoon. The gin flowed like water, the champagne popped with the rhythmic regularity of a Gatling gun, And the people, those fashionable, bored, and slightly tipsy souls who came uptown in their limousines to slum in the exotic wilds of Harlem, sought a thrill that could not be found in the stuffy, velvet-roped ballrooms of midtown Manhattan. The music, the music. It was a force of nature, a torrential downpour of rhythm and melody that threatened to tear the roof off the building. When the band began to play, you could see the floorboards tremble. It was a new sound, a sound that didn't just ask to be heard, but demanded to be felt in the marrow of your bones. It was the sound of a people who had seen the worst of the world and decided, with a defiant and joyous audacity, to laugh in its face. Duke Ellington and his lot didn't just play music, they wove a tapestry of sound that was as intricate as a spider's web and as powerful as a steam locomotive. And yet, the audience. They sat in their tuxedos and their furs, sipping their overpriced bathtub distilled cocktails, looking at this stage with a blend of fascination, nervousness, and that specific, patronizing arrogance that comes from thinking you are witnessing something authentic. They were, in the parlance of the day, discovering Harlem, as if the place had been hiding behind a curtain until they arrived to pull it aside. They brought their prejudices with them, packed in their vanity cases, and they sat in that club with a rigid, unnatural posture, trying to appear as though they weren't being completely undone by the sheer power of the performance. It is the hallmark of the human creature to want to have his cake and eat it, too. These patrons wanted the danger of the jazz. They wanted the raw, unbridled energy of the black experience, but they wanted it delivered in a safe, controlled environment where they didn't have to worry about the awkwardness of actual human equality. They wanted the passion without the participation. They wanted to witness the fire, but they wanted to remain safely behind the glass of their own social standing. The club itself was decorated in a style that can best be described as plantation chic, a design choice that is so monumentally tasteless that it almost achieves a sort of dizzying, surreal genius. There were murals of cotton fields and log cabins, a visual shorthand for a history that the performers were currently busy outplaying, outthinking, and outshining. It was a stage set for a play that had already been closed for 60 years, yet everyone acted as if it were the most natural setting in the world for a bit of late-night entertainment. One wonders what the musicians thought of it all. One imagines them, between sets, leaning against the back wall, mopping their brows, and sharing a look that contained the entire history of the world. They were professionals to the last man. They played their hearts out, they smiled at the audience, and they pocketed the check. They knew the score. They knew that in this country you are often allowed to be a genius, provided you are willing to be a genius on someone else's terms and in someone else's room. They didn't need the validation of the people in the front row. They had the music, and the music, as anyone with half a brain knows, is the only thing that is truly free. The Cotton Club became the destination. If you were a person of means and a desire to be seen, you went uptown. You navigated the stairs. You paid the cover charge. You endured the haughty glare of the doorman, and you sat at your table pretending that the world outside didn't exist. You lived in a bubble of rhythm and gin, a fragile, temporary, and utterly artificial world. It was a triumph of the ephemeral. It was the epitome of the Roaring Twenties, an era that was defined by its ability to create something beautiful, something powerful, and something profoundly wrong, all at the same time. And yet, it is impossible to dismiss the music. Even now, the ghosts of those performances still echo in the rafters of our national imagination. The jazz that was birthed in those smoky, uncomfortable, and fundamentally hypocritical nights changed the world. It broke the boundaries of melody and meter. It challenged the status quo, and it proved that art, no matter how hard you try to cage it, will always find a way to grow, to thrive, and to speak its truth. The people in the audience may have forgotten the nights, they may have forgotten the tunes, and they certainly forgot the performers. But the music? The music lived on. It seeped out of the club, it traveled down the subways, it permeated the walls of the city, and it eventually became the soundtrack of a century that was, in many ways, just as confused, just as vibrant, and just as hypocritical as the room in which that jazz was first played. It is a fascinating, if somewhat bitter, irony that a place so dedicated to the exclusion of the very people whose culture it exploited should become the temple of that culture's greatest triumph. The Cotton Club was a stage for the gifted, a playroom for the bored, and a monument to the ridiculous, beautiful, and utterly messy nature of our national life. It was a paradox in a tux, a contradiction in a cocktail glass. And as I sit here, thinking about the thousands of nights that passed within those walls, I can only marvel at the sheer, stubborn, and indefatigable power of the human spirit to find the light, even when the setting is as dark, as cramped, and as absurd as a cotton-themed night spot in the middle of a city that never stops to ask itself why it is doing what it is doing. We are a nation of dancers, I suppose. We want to be told what to do. We want to follow the beat, and we want to believe that as long as the band keeps playing, we can dance our way right out of our problems. We don't care where the stage is or who is paying for the floor, so long as the rhythm is strong enough to drown out the sound of the world's grinding, complaining, and utterly unsolvable contradictions. And so, we keep on kicking our legs, we keep on swinging our arms, and we keep on pretending that the room is perfectly fine, even as the ceiling begins to sag under the weight of all the history we are so desperately trying to ignore. It is a spectacle, truly, a spectacle worth the price of admission, even if the admission is your own common sense. Chapter 12. The Charleston Epidemic. It is a well-documented failing of the human race that we are, at heart, a species of mimics. We are like children who, upon seeing a neighbor's dog perform a particularly clever trick, immediately rush home to see if we might persuade our own cat to do the same, usually with disastrous results involving shredded curtains and a very angry feline. In the mid-20s, this mimicry took a form that was at once dizzying, exhausting, and, if one viewed it from a sufficient distance, profoundly ridiculous. I speak, of course, of the Charleston, a dance that erupted from the South like a social fever, and which proceeded to turn the entire civilized world into a collection of spastic marionettes. The Charleston began, as all truly contagious things do, in a corner of the world where people were far too busy enjoying themselves to worry about the conventions of polite society. It was a dance of legs, a dance of knees, and a dance of sheer, unadulterated velocity. One does not simply do the Charleston, one survives it. It requires the coordination of a professional athlete, the stamina of a marathon runner, and a complete disregard for the structural integrity of one's own skeletal system. The dancer, if one can call him such, must swing his arms like a windmill in a hurricane, while his feet perform a frantic kick-step-kick shuffle that makes him look like a man who has suddenly realized that the floor beneath him has become electrified. When this dance hit the mainstream, it did not arrive with a gentle knock at the door. It burst through the windows, overturning the furniture and demanding that everyone, regardless of age, station, or degree of physical fitness, join in the fray. It was an epidemic of the most frantic order. Millions of people, who a month prior had been perfectly content to waltz in a dignified and predictable fashion, were suddenly throwing their limbs about with the reckless abandon of an octopus in a tumble dryer. Consider the ballroom. In the old days, the ballroom was a place of grace. One glided, one bowed. One navigated the floor with the gentle precision of a ship in a calm harbor. But after the Charleston arrived, the ballroom became a battlefield. It was a space filled with flying elbows, kicking heels, and the desperate, sweating faces of people who had lost their minds to the tempo. It was a scene of uncoordinated carnage. You would see a man in a tuxedo, a person of supposed dignity and standing, suddenly erupt into a flurry of motion that suggested he was trying to fend off a swarm of invisible bees, all while his partner, equally possessed, engaged in a mirror image tantrum. Orthopedists across the nation began to rub their hands together in unholy glee. They were, I suspect, the only people who truly profited from the craze. Ankle sprains, knee dislocations, torn ligaments, and back strains were reported in numbers that would have suggested an invading army had swept through the population. The local physicians were kept busy day and night, setting bones and prescribing liniment to a generation that had decided quite suddenly that the secret to happiness was to treat one's body like a broken clock. There is a deep, abiding humor in the spectacle of a nation losing its collective equilibrium. We are such a serious people, are we not? We worry about our money. We worry about our politics. We worry about the state of our souls. And yet, give us a fast enough beat and a bit of peer pressure, and we will happily turn ourselves into a laughing stock for the sake of fitting in. It is the great enduring comedy of the American character. We are always looking for the next trend, the next big thing, the next way to distinguish ourselves from our neighbors. And if that means we must kick our legs until we are blue in the face, well then, pass the gin and clear the floor. The dance, of course, was marketed as modern. Everything in the 20s was modern, or it was nothing. To be modern was to be fast, to be loud, to be liberated, and to be entirely unconcerned with the consequences of one's actions. The Charleston was the physical embodiment of this ethos. It was a rejection of the slow, the stately, and the sensible. It was a dance that said, I am here, I am moving, and I do not give a damn if I knock over the punch bowl on my way to oblivion. And the young people, oh, the young people, they took to it with a ferocity that was genuinely alarming to their elders. They looked at the older generation with their stiff collars and their predictable waltzes, and they saw a history that they were determined to outrun. They wanted to move faster than the world could follow. They wanted to be a blur, and the Charleston was the perfect vessel for their impatience. It was the dance of a generation that felt the ground shifting beneath its feet and decided that if the world was going to end, it might as well end with a flourish of kicking legs and a great booming bass drum. But let us be fair. The dance had its charms. It was, if nothing else, a magnificent display of human energy. When you had a room full of people truly committed to the craft, When the music was soaring and the feet were moving in perfect frantic unison, it possessed a raw, primitive power that was impossible to ignore. It was a celebration of the body, a reclaiming of the self, and a momentary blissful escape from the crushing weight of the daily grind. For those few minutes, you were not an employee, you were not a taxpayer, you were not a worrywart, you were simply motion. You were energy. You were a part of something larger and more chaotic than yourself. Of course, the fad eventually burnt itself out, as all fires do once the fuel has been consumed. People realized that their joints were not made of iron, and that the thrill of looking like a marionette in an earthquake had its limits. They eventually returned to more sedate, if no less ridiculous, modes of expression. But for a few years, the country was a spectacle of knees and elbows. We were, for a brief moment, a nation of dancers. And even if our moves were mostly bad, and even if our ankles paid the price, we had, at the very least, proved that we could move. It is a strange thing to think about now, in the quiet, reflective distance of time. We look back at the photos, the film clips, the grainy images of those frenzied crowds, and we can't help but smile at the sheer, unbridled silliness of it all. But there is a part of me, the part that still remembers the itch of a good rhythm, that understands why they did it. We are all of us looking for a way to break the rhythm of the mundane, to step outside the lines that have been drawn for us, and to see if, perhaps, we can fly, even if only for a second, even if only for the duration of a song. The Charleston was our chance to fly, provided we didn't mind landing on our faces. It was our chance to be wild, to be reckless, and to be entirely, perfectly, and gloriously human. And if we look a little foolish in the history books, well, let the historians be serious. They have their ledgers and their textbooks to keep them company. As for us, we have the rhythm, we have the kick, and we have the memory of the time when, for a brief, beautiful moment, the whole world looked like it was falling apart, and we decided to celebrate by dancing in the wreckage. That is an accomplishment of a sort, and it is one that I, for one, find rather endearing, even if my back still aches at the thought of it. Chapter 13. The Great Kantō Cataclysm. It is a profound and unsettling truth that the earth, for all its reputation as a solid, dependable sort of fellow, is actually a most temperamental and fickle companion. We build our homes, our monuments, and our empires upon its surface, treating it as if it were a floorboards of a permanent parlor, completely forgetting that we are, in reality, living on the back of a restless, slumbering beast that is occasionally inclined to shift its weight just to see what happens to the ants above. In the year 1923, the earth beneath Tokyo and Yokohama decided to perform such a rearrangement, and it did so with a level of enthusiasm that bordered on the theatrical. It was a cataclysm of the most absolute sort, a grand tectonic tantrum that unleashed fire, wind, and destruction upon a region that had, quite reasonably, spent centuries building itself out of wood and paper. It is a peculiar habit of civilization to prioritize beauty over bulletproofing, and the Japanese, a people of exquisite taste, found that their delicate architecture was no match for the violent, convulsive heave of the soil. The earth did not merely shake, it surged. It rippled like a rug pulled by a giant, throwing cities into the air and setting the stage for a catastrophe that would redefine the geography of the nation in a matter of minutes. As the ground cracked and the buildings collapsed like houses of cards, the true villain of the piece began to assert itself. Fire. It was the lunch hour, you see, the time when every stove, every charcoal brazier, and every open flame in the city was engaged in the noble, necessary business of cooking rice and fish. When the earthquake struck, the stoves were tipped, the embers were scattered, and the cities, built of dry timber and centuries of tradition, became an immense, sprawling pyre. The spectacle was of such magnitude that it transcended the mere description of disaster and entered the realm of the apocalyptic. Fire tornadoes, those swirling, towering pillars of flame that seemed to have stepped directly out of the pages of a particularly grim theological warning, tore through the ruins, leaping from block to block with the predatory grace of a hungry tiger. People fled to the rivers, to the parks, and to the open spaces, only to find that the fire was not merely a local nuisance, it was an atmospheric event. The air itself seemed to burn. One might imagine that in such a moment the human creature would succumb to despair, and to a degree they did. But there is also a grim, stubborn resilience that appears only when the ordinary rules of life have been incinerated. There were stories of people carrying their most precious possessions, a teacup, a scroll, a cat, through a wall of heat, guided by nothing but the desperate, irrational instinct to save a piece of their identity from the maw of the inferno. It is a testament to the fact that we are above all else keepers of fragments. We believe that if we can just hold on to the pieces, we can eventually reassemble the whole, even when the whole has been turned to ash. Japan, a nation that has spent its history learning how to endure the unendurable, looked upon the smoking ruins of its capital and decided that if it was to rebuild, it would not repeat the mistakes of the past. They had built with paper, and they had been consumed. Now they would build with iron, with concrete, and with the cold, unyielding strength of modernity. It was a tragic reset, yes, but it was also a pivot. They began to look toward the skyline not as a collection of wood-carved dreams, but as an engineering problem to be solved. It is a strange irony, is it not, that the very cataclysm that destroyed the heart of the old world provided the impetus for the architecture of the new? The great Kantō cataclysm was the end of the Romantic era of Tokyo architecture and the beginning of the era of the steel skeleton. It was the moment the city stopped being a garden and started being a machine. And while one cannot help but mourn the loss of the delicate, the intricate, and the ancient, there is a certain chilling efficiency in the way humanity adapts to the destruction of its own creation. We do not stop. We simply reach for the concrete mixer. As for the rest of the world, we watched from afar, our newspapers filled with the grainy, soot-smudged images of the devastation. We felt the requisite pity, we donated our coins, and we expressed our profound, fleeting shock at the fragility of existence. We are always shocked by these things, are we not? As if we haven't been told repeatedly for thousands of years that the earth is not our servant, and that our cities are merely temporary arrangements of material. We act as if the status quo is a law of nature, and we are perpetually surprised when the law is repealed by a tectonic shift. It serves as a reminder, I suppose, that our civilization is a thin, precarious layer of paint on a very large and very active planet. We worry about our stock prices, we worry about the tone of our correspondence, and we worry about whether the dinner party went well all the while standing on a crust of rock that is currently floating on a sea of molten chaos. It is the height of human arrogance, but perhaps it is necessary. If we spent all our time worrying about the impending catastrophe, we would never get around to building anything at all. We would simply sit in the dirt and wait for the floor to drop out from under us. Instead, we build. We build high, we build wide, and we build with the foolish, beautiful, and utterly unshakable belief that this time it will last. And then, when the earth decides to have its say, we pick up the pieces, we mourn the dead, we reinvent the design, and we start again. The Japanese, in the aftermath of their tragedy, proved that they had a spirit that was more durable than any timber or any stone. They took the ashes of their past and mixed them into the mortar of their future. It is a lesson for us all, really. The earth may be our master in the physical sense, but the human will is the master of our own meaning. You can burn the house, you can topple the tower, and you can erase the landmark, but you cannot easily destroy the intent of the people who put them there. They will just build a stronger one, and if that one falls, they will build a stronger one still. It is a repetitive, exhausting, and entirely necessary cycle of human endeavor. So, as we look back on the Kantō event, let us not just see the fire, let us see the concrete, let us see the resilience, and let us, if we have the sense to do so, reflect on the fact that we are all, every one of us, living in a house of cards, and that the only thing keeping us from catastrophe is the temporary and entirely conditional patience of the ground beneath our feet. It is a sobering thought, but one that might make us a little more appreciative of the sturdy chair we are sitting in, the roof over our heads, and the fact that, for this particular afternoon at least, the earth has decided to remain perfectly, beautifully, and mercifully still. One can only hope that it stays in such a mood for a good long while, but if it doesn't, well, I have heard that concrete is quite effective, and I have no doubt that we will all be very busy indeed. Chapter 14. Garrett Morgan's Third Light. It is a profound and unsettling truth that the history of human progress is measured less by our grand inventions, the steam engine, the printing press, the electric light, and more by our desperate attempts to keep ourselves from bumping into one another. We are by nature a collision-prone species. Give a man a horse, and he will inevitably find a way to collide with a tree. Give him a motor car, and he will treat the public thoroughfare as if it were a private battlefield, where the laws of physics are merely a suggestion and the laws of good sense are an offensive, antiquated nuisance. Before the 1920s, the intersection was a place of high drama and higher tragedy. It was a chaotic theater where the bold, the reckless, and the utterly oblivious played a game of chicken every single time they reached a corner. You had your motor cars, your wagons, your bicycles, and your pedestrians all converging upon a single point with no more guidance than the frantic waving of a policeman's arms, or, more often than not, a silent, prayerful hope that everyone else would have the decency to yield. It was a system that worked about as well as a blind man trying to navigate a minefield, and the resulting debris of crushed fenders and injured pride was becoming a national pastime of the most expensive sort. Then came Mr. Garrett Morgan. Now, Mr. Morgan was a man of the sort of practical, inquisitive mind that our age is so desperately lacking. He was an inventor who did not waste his time on the trivialities of the day. He was a man who looked at a problem, a real bleeding, inconvenient problem, and asked himself, is there not a way to solve this with a bit of geometry and some common sense? He saw the carnage at the intersections. He saw the confusion, the rage, and the broken glass, and he realized that the problem was not a lack of effort, but a lack of information. Up until that point, the traffic signal was a binary affair. It told you to stop, or it told you to go. It was a black and white world, a world of binary commands that left no room for the hesitation, the contemplation, or the simple human act of preparing for a change of heart. It was a system for machines, not for men. It assumed that a driver could instantly transition from a state of dead-stop inertia to the forward velocity of a cannonball without any sort of transition period. Mr. Morgan, being a man of significant insight, realized that the world needed a middle ground. It needed a warning. He patented a third position. He introduced the concept of the yield, the amber flicker that serves as the moral conscience of the traffic signal. It was the introduction of patience into the intersection. It was the invention of a pause, a breath, a moment of reflection between the absolute commands of the road. It told the driver, "My friend, your time of movement is coming to a close, and it would be the better part of valor to slow your machine and prepare for the silence." It was a gesture of profound, almost poetic, politeness in a world that was rapidly losing the ability to be polite. The public, of course, was initially baffled. We are a people who love a clear command, and the addition of a third light was seen as a complication of the most unnecessary sort. Why warn a man to stop, they wondered, when you can just wait for him to be startled into stillness by the sudden appearance of a red light? But as the lights began to appear on the corners, as the chaos began to subside, and as the death toll at the intersections began to creep downward, the genius of the invention became impossible to deny. The amber light became the universal symbol for take heed. It became the signal that even in the middle of the frantic mechanical roar of the industrial age, there is still room for a bit of caution. One cannot help but admire the man. Mr. Morgan was an African-American inventor in a time when the recognition of such achievements was often stifled by the narrow-mindedness of a society that was not yet ready to acknowledge the brilliance of all its citizens. He did not let the limitations of his age discourage him. He did not let the closed doors stop his progress. He simply kept inventing. He kept solving. He kept finding ways to make the world a little less dangerous for the rest of us. His traffic signal is a testament to the fact that the most important inventions are not the ones that take us to the moon or the ones that promise to solve the mysteries of the universe. They are the ones that save us from our own stupidity. Think of it. Every time you approach a light, every time you see that yellow glow flickering in the dark, every time you lift your foot from the accelerator and give a polite nod to the laws of safety, you are participating in a system created by a man who looked at our collective foolishness and decided to offer us a way out. It is a small thing, perhaps. It is a mundane, utilitarian thing, but it is a thing of grace. There is a lesson here, I think, for the philosophers and the politicians who are currently busy rearranging the furniture of our national life. They are always trying to give us stop or go. They are always trying to force us into a binary choice, demanding that we either accelerate into the future or slam on the brakes and stay exactly where we are. They never seem to understand the importance of the amber light. They never seem to realize that a society, much like an intersection, cannot function without the ability to slow down, to prepare, and to consider the consequences before we crash into the side of our neighbor. We are so obsessed with speed. We are so obsessed with the idea that the road belongs to the person who can reach the destination the fastest. We have forgotten that the road is a shared space, and that the greatest achievement of the modern era was not the internal combustion engine, but the ability to regulate it. We have forgotten that we are all, in the end, just drivers trying to get home without a scratch on our bumpers, and that the only thing standing between us and catastrophe is the patience we show one another at the corner. Garrett Morgan's third light is a beacon of common sense. It is a monument to the idea that a warning is better than a collision, that a pause is better than a panic, and that we are capable, if given the right tools, of managing our own excesses. It is an invention that has saved countless lives, and yet I suspect most people drive right past his legacy without giving it a second thought. They are too busy checking their watches, too busy listening to the radio, too busy trying to beat the light. It is a pity, really. We should pause, at least once, to thank the man who gave us the gift of time. We should consider, as we wait for the green, that we are living in a world shaped by a man who saw the danger, saw the need, and decided to light a lamp in the dark. It is a legacy that does not require a statue in a park or a plaque in a museum. It exists on every corner, in every city, in every heart that knows the value of a moment's hesitation. It is the most democratic, the most necessary, and the most invisible of all our accomplishments. And as I sit here watching the light turn yellow, I feel a genuine sense of gratitude for the man who saw that we were moving too fast and who gave us the light to tell us to slow down before it was too late. One can only hope that in the other, more complex intersections of our lives, we have the sense to pay as much attention as we do on the road. But I fear that is a lesson for another, perhaps more careful, generation. For now, let us be thankful for the light and for the man who had the foresight to turn it on. Chapter 15. The Invention of the Q-Tip. It is a most peculiar endeavor to attempt to map the history of human progress. The serious scholars, with their furrowed brows and their dusty ledgers, will insist upon pointing to the Treaty of Versailles or the discovery of the quantum atom as the defining moments of the age. But I, having spent a lifetime observing the curious habits of my fellow man, contend that the true milestones of civilization are to be found in the medicine cabinet, the pantry, and the nursery. We are, at our core, a species that is perpetually obsessed with the microscopic maintenance of our own persons. We are forever scrubbing, polishing, trimming, and sanitizing, as if by enough diligent application of soap and cotton we might finally wash away the inherent stubborn messiness of the human condition. Enter, in the mid-20s, a gentleman by the name of Leo Gerstenzang. Mr. Gerstenzang was a man of vision, though his vision was not turned toward the heavens or the markets of the world, but toward the ear canal of his own infant child. He had been watching his wife, a woman of commendable, if perhaps overzealous, standards of hygiene, as she attempted to navigate the delicate geometry of a baby's anatomy with a toothpick wrapped in a wad of cotton. It was a perilous procedure, a bit of domestic surgery that required the steady hand of a master watchmaker and the nerves of a bomb disposal expert. Mr. Gerstenzang, being a man who preferred his solutions to be slightly more permanent and significantly less likely to result in a trip to the local infirmary, realized that the world was in dire need of a dedicated tool, and so he performed the most simple, the most brilliant, and the most thoroughly inevitable act of creation. He attached a precise, machine-wound puff of cotton to the end of a wooden stick, and thus birthed the baby gay. One must pause to appreciate the sheer audacity of the name. Baby gay. It is a moniker that sounds like a character from a nursery rhyme written by a man who had spent too much time in the sun, but the utility of the object was undeniable. It was the ultimate necessary appendage for a civilization that had suddenly become obsessed with the idea that cleanliness was not just next to godliness, but a fundamental requirement for the maintenance of a respectable household. The Q-tip, for that is the name by which it would eventually be known to the masses, became the silent, ubiquitous servant of the modern home. It arrived at a time when we were collectively deciding that every crevice, every fold, and every microscopic corner of our existence needed to be attended to with a level of rigor that would have astonished our ancestors. We were, quite suddenly, a people who could not abide the idea of a speck of dirt, a bit of earwax, or a trace of dust existing in the private sanctuary of our own bodies. We were, in effect, inventing a new kind of frontier, the frontier of the inner ear. It is a grand, hilarious, and thoroughly whimsical pursuit. Think of the millions of hours that have been spent by the citizenry of this great nation, standing before the bathroom mirror, wielding these tiny cotton-tipped wands like miniature knights tilting at invisible windmills. We perform this ritual with a devotion that is truly religious. We believe, with an unshakable faith, that if we can just reach that one final bit of blockage, if we can just achieve that state of perfect ringing clarity, we will finally be at peace with the world. We are, in our own small bathroom-bound way, trying to purify ourselves of the noise and the grit of the daily grind. And what of the object itself? It is a marvel of simplicity. It is a stick, and it is cotton. It is so simple that a caveman could have invented it, had he the inclination to keep his ears clean, which he certainly did not. It is the sort of invention that makes one wonder why it took us so long to arrive at it. But that is the way of the world. We are always looking for the complicated, the dramatic, and the grandiose, all the while ignoring the fact that the most profound changes to our daily life are usually the ones that fit in the palm of our hand. The Q-tip also served as a barometer for our changing relationship with the body. We were moving away from the robust, hearty, and somewhat dirty reality of life on the farm, and into the polished, sanitized, and deeply nervous reality of the suburban home. We were terrified of germs, we were terrified of dirt, and we were terrified of anything that suggested we were, at our hearts, biological creatures with ears that occasionally produced wax. We wanted to be as pristine as a porcelain doll, and Mr. Gerstenzang gave us the tools to perform that act of constant daily maintenance. One cannot help but smile at the thought of it. We look back at the 1920s as an era of jazz, of prohibition, of frantic dancing, and of global upheaval. But it was also the era of the Q-tip. It was the era when we collectively decided that our ears should be as tidy as our ledgers. It is a detail that the history books always seem to skip over, and yet It is a detail that tells you more about the soul of the average American than any speech delivered by a politician on the steps of the Capitol. We are a nation of cleaners. We are a nation that is perpetually trying to tidy up the world, and when we run out of things to tidy, we turn our attention to ourselves. We scrub our faces, we brush our teeth, and we delve into our own ears with the precision of an archaeologist uncovering a lost city. It is a harmless enough habit, I suppose, provided you do not push the cotton too far into the canal and end up causing the very deafness you were trying to prevent, but that is a risk we are all apparently quite willing to take for the sake of a clean, clear, and perfectly sanitized life. The invention of the Q-tip was, in its own quiet way, a declaration of independence from the messiness of nature. It was our way of saying, I may be a biological entity, but I am an entity that is under my own control, and I will be damned if I am going to let a bit of wax dictate my experience of the world. It is a funny, defiant, and thoroughly human statement. And as I sit here reflecting on the march of history, I can only marvel at the fact that so much of what we call civilization is really just a series of clever ways to keep ourselves feeling a little bit fresher, a little bit lighter, and a little bit more in control of the damp, dark, and stubborn reality of our own anatomy. So, here is to Mr. Gersten Zhang and his baby gaze. He gave us a tool that allowed us to poke and prod at the most sensitive parts of our own selves, and for that, he deserves a place in the pantheon of the greats. He understood the fundamental truth of the American experience, that we are a people who will never be truly satisfied until we have polished every surface, wiped away every smudge, and reached every unreachable corner of our own existence. It is a task that will never be finished, of course. The wax will return, the dirt will gather, and the dust will settle, no matter how many cotton-tipped wands we deploy. But we will keep trying. We will keep swabbing. We will keep polishing. And in that endless, repetitive, and perfectly futile labor, we will find our own particular, peculiar, and distinctly American sort of peace. After all, if you can't keep the world clean, you might at least try to keep your own ears in order, and that, I suppose, is as good a strategy for survival as any. Chapter 16. The Coast-to-Coast Non-Stop Flight. It has been a long-standing grievance of mine that the world is entirely too large. It is a sprawling, cumbersome, and inconveniently shaped place, full of mountains that refuse to move, rivers that refuse to dry up, and vast, empty distances that seem designed specifically to ensure that a man who wishes to be in San Diego is currently stuck in New York, nursing a lukewarm coffee and wondering if the train will ever bother to depart. We are creatures of ambition living in a geography of inertia, and the history of our species is, in large part, a history of our increasingly desperate attempts to overcome the physical reality of the map. In the year 1923, two military pilots, men whose names sound as though they were crafted specifically for the purpose of appearing in the back of a history textbook, decided that they had quite enough of the slow, methodical, and profoundly tedious business of traveling across the continent. They looked at a Fokker transport plane, a contraption that possessed all the aerodynamic grace of a flying brick, and decided that it was high time to see if the United States could be folded in half. The plan was simple, which is the hallmark of every idea that will eventually result in either a glorious triumph or a very expensive hole in the ground. They would take off from New York, they would fly until they reached San Diego, and they would not, under any circumstances, land in between. It was to be a non-stop journey, a feat of endurance that would turn the continent from a month-long ordeal into a single, breathless, and entirely exhausting day. They climbed into the cockpit, a space so cramped and smelling so strongly of oil, grease, and the peculiar metallic tang of fear that one wonders how they didn't simply faint from the sheer unadulterated reality of it. There were no comfortable seats, no flight attendants bearing trays of beverages, and certainly no navigation systems that would tell them where they were with the push of a button. There was only a map, a compass, and the roar of an engine that sounded like a giant caught in a particularly violent temper tantrum. They took off, and for the next 26 hours, they were the inmates of an asylum that was currently soaring 3,000 feet above the rooftops of the world. They breathed grease. They inhaled the fumes of burning fuel. They were deafened by the relentless clanking and utterly indifferent voice of the motor. They were in a state of suspended animation, a sort of high-altitude purgatory, where the only thing that mattered was the steady rhythmic vibration of the propeller and the hope that it would keep turning until they reached the Pacific. It is a curious thing to think about, the sheer, stubborn, and profoundly unromantic reality of such a journey. We like to think of flying as an act of soaring, of gliding through the clouds with the ease of a bird. In reality, it is a battle. It is a grueling, grueling contest between the frailty of the human frame and the indifference of the atmosphere. They didn't look at the scenery. They didn't contemplate the majesty of the American landscape. They were too busy trying to keep the plane from shaking itself to pieces and praying that they hadn't misread the map, which, given the darkness of the night and the limited intelligence of the average compass, was a distinct and terrifying possibility. They did not stop to eat, they did not stop to stretch their legs, and they certainly did not stop to ask for directions, which is, in my experience, the only way a man ever manages to get anywhere important. They just flew. They flew through the dawn, they flew through the heat of the day, and they flew through the long, lonely, and profoundly quiet hours of the night. They were the pioneers of the long haul, the men who first understood that the secret to shrinking the world is simply to refuse to acknowledge that it has any edges. When they finally landed in San Diego, a place that must have looked like a vision of heaven to a pair of men who had spent the better part of a day and a night inside a pressurized, grease-filled box, they were not greeted with the fanfare one might expect. They were not draped in garlands or serenaded by a choir of angels. They climbed out of the plane, stiff, deaf, and smelling like a garage. And they discovered that, quite suddenly, the continent had been reduced to a single, digestible experience. It was a feat of mechanical masochism that set the tone for the rest of the century. We decided on that day that distance was a nuisance to be eliminated. We decided that the time it took to cross the country was not a part of the experience, but a waste of our lives. We became a people who wanted to be there, and we didn't much care what happened to us in the process of getting there. We became obsessed with the destination, and we were perfectly willing to trade our comfort, our peace of mind, and even our own basic sanity for the privilege of being able to say that we had arrived before the clock had finished its cycle. And what did we gain? We gained the ability to be anywhere at any time, provided we were willing to endure the indignity of the journey. We turned the vast, unfolding, and infinitely varied landscape of the United States into a blur of clouds and runway lights. We traded the slow, rhythmic, and thoroughly human experience of travel for the fast, mechanical, and entirely soulless experience of transit. One cannot help but look back at those two pilots and feel a sense of profound, complicated admiration. They were the pathfinders of our own impatience. They were the men who looked at the wide, open, and inviting spaces of the nation and decided that they were nothing more than a series of obstacles to be vaulted over in a Fokker transport. They did what we all wanted to do, and they did it with a courage that is truly commendable, even if the reason for their courage was fundamentally and perhaps dangerously misplaced. We are a nation of speed freaks, I suppose. We like to think that we are conquering the world, but in reality, we are just running away from the distances. We are trying to outrace the map, trying to outfly the reality of our own limitations, and trying to convince ourselves that if we can just get to the other side fast enough, we will finally be at peace. But the distance remains. The mountains are still there, the rivers are still flowing, and the world is still just as wide, just as deep, and just as full of mysteries as it was before we decided to fly over it. It is a good thing to be able to cross the country in a day, I grant you. It is a wonderful convenience to be able to leave the snows of New York and arrive in the sunshine of San Diego in the time it takes to lose a day's worth of productivity. But let us not forget the price we paid. We paid for it in the loss of our ability to see the world as it unfolds. We paid for it in the loss of the journey, and we paid for it in the realization that we are, in the end, just a pair of tired, grease-covered men stepping out of a noisy machine, wondering where on earth we have landed and whether it was truly worth all the trouble to get there. The continent has been shrunken, yes, but I wonder if we have grown any larger. I wonder if we have become better people because we can reach the other side in 26 hours, or if we have simply become more efficient at being exactly who we were before we left. I suspect the latter. But that is the nature of progress, is it not? It is not about becoming better. It is about becoming faster. It is about narrowing the gap until the gap disappears entirely, leaving us alone with our own restlessness and a very loud, very complicated, and entirely unfulfilling machine. One can only hope that in the years to come we will find a way to slow down again, to look out the window, and to remember that the point of the journey is not to reach the end, but to be a part of the middle. But I suspect I am whistling in a gale. We have tasted the speed, and now we will never be satisfied with anything else. The Fokker has landed, the engine is cooling, and the world, the fast, loud, and shrinking world, is waiting for us to take the next flight. I just hope, for all our sakes, that we remember where we were trying to go in the first place. Chapter 17, The Inaugural 24 Hours of Le Mans. It is a well-established fact among those of us who have spent any appreciable time contemplating the peculiar and often suicidal tendencies of the human species that there is no challenge so ridiculous that a man will not eventually convince himself it is a noble pursuit. If you give a man a mule, he will eventually try to race it against a neighbor's horse. If you give him a boat, he will immediately decide that the Atlantic is far too wide and that he must cross it in record time, preferably while eating a sandwich. But when you give a man an internal combustion engine that marvelous, clanking, temperamental beast, he immediately loses all sense of self-preservation and begins to look for ways to push the machine and himself until something, and preferably not his own spirit, breaks. In the year 1923, a group of French gentlemen who were clearly suffering from an excess of leisure time and a terrifying lack of domestic responsibilities decided that the conventional motor races of the day were far too civilized. A sprint around a track for an hour or two, it was merely a stroll in the park. It was for children. It was entirely lacking in the necessary element of suffering. No, what the world needed, they decided, was an endurance test that would stretch the very concept of mechanical reliability until it snapped like a dry twig. And so, the 24 Hours of Le Mans was born, a race that did not end when the sun went down, but continued through the pitch-black night, through the rain, through the fog, and through the slow, creeping madness of sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. Imagine, if you will, a car, a vehicle that was, at the time, little more than a collection of moving parts held together by hope and a liberal application of grease, being driven at the absolute limit of its capacity for an entire day and night. The drivers were not athletes in the modern sense. They were more akin to chimney sweeps who had decided to take up competitive motoring. They wore leather helmets that offered the protection of a wet napkin, goggles that served mainly to collect the dust of the track, and an expression of grim, terminal resignation. They were the pioneers of the mechanical torture school of athletics. The race began, and the machines roared to life with the sound of 1,000 angry sewing machines. The goal was not merely to be the fastest, a task that, given the quality of the roads and the temperament of the engines, was a purely theoretical ambition, but to be the last one left standing. It was a war of attrition. The track at Le Mans was not a polished, pampered circuit. It was a rough, unpredictable ribbon of gravel and dirt that did its best to shake the bolts out of the chassis and the sanity out of the driver. As the sun set, the true character of the race revealed itself. In the dark, a motor car ceases to be a machine and becomes a flickering, growling phantom. The drivers, deprived of sleep, began to see things that were not there. They saw ghosts in the hedges, they saw demons in the headlights, and they saw, with a clarity that only total fatigue can provide, the absolute, inevitable futility of the entire endeavor. And yet they pressed on. They shifted gears until their hands were raw. They steered through the mud until their shoulders screamed. And they listened, with a devotion usually reserved for a prayer, to the rhythmic, sputtering pulse of the engine. There was a peculiar, almost mystical beauty to the thing. To watch those cars emerge from the fog in the small hours of the morning, their headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of some weary, iron-clad animal, was to see the true nature of the industrial age. We had built these contraptions. We had mastered the science of the piston and the valve, and yet we were still at the mercy of the elements. We were still, fundamentally, a species that was trying to prove that we could master the night, even as our own bodies were begging us to curl up in a ball and sleep for a century. The crowds, bless their perverse, bloodthirsty hearts, watched the whole thing with a fascination that bordered on the grotesque. They stood in the rain, they huddled under umbrellas, and they cheered whenever a car managed to complete another lap without exploding into a plume of flame and jagged metal. They were witnessing the birth of a new kind of mythology, the myth of the unbreakable machine. They were participating in the first great ritual of the 20th century, the celebration of human endurance as manifested through the proxy of a carbureted engine. And the internal combustion engine, it proved itself to be a beast of remarkable and stubborn character. It might leak, it might smoke, it might rattle, and it might occasionally give up the ghost entirely, but when it worked, it was a miracle of relentless, unthinking, and profoundly mechanical persistence. It proved that it could survive the rain, it could survive the mud, and it could survive the utter crushing incompetence of a driver who had been awake for 18 hours and could no longer distinguish between the brake and the accelerator. It was a triumph of design, yes, but more importantly, it was a triumph of the sheer, bloody-minded refusal of the thing to quit. One cannot help but compare the race to the history of the world itself. We are all of us in a 24-hour race, aren't we? We are all hurtling toward some distant, invisible finish line, and we are all doing it with machines that are constantly on the verge of breaking down. We are all battling our own exhaustion, our own doubts, and the unpredictable, muddy, and thoroughly uncooperative nature of the track we have been assigned. We all have our headlights, we all have our gears, and we all have that same stubborn pulse of the engine, driving us forward even when we would much rather be doing anything else. The inaugural 24 hours of Le Mans did not solve any of the world's problems, of course. It did not end the wars, it did not fix the economy, and it certainly did not provide a cure for the human tendency to do the most dangerous thing possible for the sake of a trophy that was, in all likelihood, made of cheap tin. But it provided something else. It provided a spectacle of survival. It gave us a moment to stand back and witness the sheer gritty capacity of the human-machine hybrid to endure the impossible. And as the checkered flag finally fell, a signal of such overwhelming, blessed relief that one imagines the drivers wept with joy. The world looked at those mud-caked, smoking, and utterly exhausted vehicles and realized that we had entered a new epoch. We had entered an age where speed, endurance, and the capacity to survive the night were the highest virtues. We had entered an age of the race, and we were all, whether we liked it or not, strapped into the driver's seat. I, for one, find the whole thing rather charming in a way. It is so perfectly, uniquely, and quintessentially human to take a machine that was designed to get you to the grocery store and instead run it into the ground for 24 hours just to see if it can be done. It is the sort of madness that built the pyramids, that discovered the Americas, and that eventually landed us on the moon. It is a madness that says, I am here, I am moving, and I will keep moving until the last drop of fuel is gone, even if I have no idea why I'm doing it or where I'm going. It is a philosophy of a sort, a loud, smoky, and thoroughly exhausting philosophy, but a philosophy nonetheless. One can only hope that, in the final lap of our own lives, we have the sense to finish with a bit of grace, even if we are as mud-caked and rattled as the heroes of that first, long-forgotten night in France. But I suspect we will finish exactly like the cars, smoking, sputtering, and perhaps just a little bit proud that we made it to the end at all. And that, I suppose, is enough. Chapter 18, Tutankhamun, Part 2, The Sarcophagus Unveiled. It is a curious and melancholy truth that the human species suffers from a chronic and incurable addiction to the past. We are not content to live in our own century with all its wonderful noises, its shiny new machines, and its delightful confusions. We must forever be digging in the dirt, hoping to catch a glimpse of some long-dead king who had the good sense to die before the invention of the income tax. In the year of our Lord 1924, this obsession reached a fever pitch, centered entirely upon a pile of sand in the Valley of the Kings and a young pharaoh who had been forgotten by history for 3 millennia, only to be resurrected as the greatest celebrity of the Roaring Twenties. Howard Carter, a man whose patience was of a quality that would have shamed a saint and whose stubbornness would have annoyed a mule, finally managed to pry open the final seal. The world waited with bated breath, as if the lifting of a dusty lid were going to somehow explain why we are all here and where we are all going. When the inner chamber was revealed and the solid gold coffin caught the light of the electric bulbs, a modern artificial sun shining upon a relic of the ancient natural one, it was as if a jolt of electricity had passed through the collective consciousness of the globe. There he lay, a teenager who had been the master of Egypt for a few brief years, a boy who had likely spent his days wondering if the wine was properly spiced, and his nights worrying about the stability of his borders, only to be turned into an object of global adoration. It is a profound irony that the pharaoh, who would have wanted nothing more than to be left in the undisturbed silence of his tomb, had been dragged into the glare of the 20th century to be gawked at by journalists, politicians, and people who would have been horrified to learn that he was, at his core, just another human being who had had the misfortune of being born into a very uncomfortable crown. Global fashion, that fickle and flighty mistress, immediately decided that Egyptian was the only thing worth being. Suddenly, every dress, every teapot, every lamp, and every piece of jewelry had to look like something that had been unearthed from the desert. Women who had never been further east than the local department store were suddenly walking around looking like the Queen of the Nile, adorned in lotus patterns and scarab pins that would have struck a real ancient Egyptian as a particularly bizarre form of cultural misappropriation. It was a craze of the most whimsical and ridiculous sort, a grand global masquerade where we all pretended that we were descended from a civilization we didn't understand, serving a king whose name we could barely pronounce. One cannot help but laugh at the absurdity of the spectacle. We are a people who live in a state of perpetual frantic novelty, and yet we are so desperate for a sense of permanence that we will happily wrap ourselves in the trappings of a dead empire just to feel a bit more substantial. We are like children who, having grown bored of our own toys, decide to raid the attic and put on the dusty, moth-eaten clothes of our great-grandparents, parading around the living room and imagining that we have acquired a bit of their dignity along with their outdated fashion. The sarcophagus itself, that solid gold box of such exquisite craftsmanship that it defied the very notion of time, was the centerpiece of the drama. It was the ultimate, shimmering and unreachable goal of the scavenger. It was the physical manifestation of all our human greed, our curiosity, and our desperate, frantic need to be the one who touches the gold. We look at that gold, and we see not the history of a civilization, but the reflection of our own desire to possess something that is eternal. We forget that the pharaoh, for all his gold, for all his tombs, and for all his careful preservation, ended up in exactly the same place as the beggar who died on the street corner 3,000 years ago. He ended up as a subject of curiosity for people who would never understand the world he had inhabited. And the curse, We must not forget the curse. The press, those tireless and highly imaginative architects of the public imagination, decided that the tomb must be haunted. They wove tales of sudden deaths, of mysterious omens, and of a divine retribution that was waiting for anyone who dared to disturb the pharaoh's sleep. It was a delicious bit of nonsense, a perfect garnish to the story. We love a good ghost story, mostly because it makes the mundane act of stealing a king's treasure feel like a high-stakes adventure. We want to believe that the world has a bit of magic left in it, even if that magic is exclusively designed to protect the interests of a dead boy king. The scientists, the archaeologists, and the scholars, meanwhile, busied themselves with the measurements, the cataloging, and the tedious necessary work of turning the mystery into a set of facts. They were the ones who had to deal with the reality of the tomb, the crumbling linen, the dried flowers, and the scent of an age that was as remote from ours as the moon. They were the ones who saw the human being beneath the gold. They saw the boy who had died too young, the king who had been a pawn of his priests, and the monarch whose only legacy had been a tomb that survived because it was, quite literally, buried by the accidents of history. It is a sobering thought, is it not? That we are all, in the end, just future archaeological finds waiting for a disaster to preserve us. We are all building our own tombs, whether they be made of gold or ledger books or the memories of our friends. We are all trying to leave a mark, trying to ensure that someone, somewhere, will dig us up and wonder what we were like. And if we are lucky, if we are very, very lucky, they will remember our names, but they will almost certainly get the story wrong. They will turn us into a fashion statement or a ghost story or a historical footnote, and they will go about their business in their own frantic, misguided century, never realizing that we were just as confused, just as hopeful, and just as human as they are. The unveiling of Tutankhamun was the ultimate proof that the world is a stage and that we are all, in our own way, participating in a play that was written long before we arrived and will continue long after we have left. We act our parts, we wear the costumes, we recite the lines, and we worry about the audience, all while the pharaoh sleeps on, indifferent to the gold, indifferent to the fashion, and indifferent to the fact that his name has become a buzzword for a generation that wouldn't know a shabty from a shoehorn. So, here is to the young king. May he rest in whatever peace he can find, despite the cameras, the newspapers, and the millions of people who have decided that he belongs to them. He was a boy who lived, he was a king who died, and he is a relic who continues to remind us that no matter how hard we try to outrun time, time will eventually catch up with us all, wrap us in gold, and hand us over to the curiosity of the future. It is a fate that awaits us all, and really, one could do much worse than to be remembered, even if it is for the wrong reasons. After all, being a fashion statement is a damn sight better than being forgotten, and for a boy who lost his crown 3 millennia ago, I suspect he is getting the better end of the deal than most. One can only hope that wherever he is, he has a sense of humor about the whole affair. I suspect he does. He'd have to. Wouldn't you? Chapter 19. The Arrival of the Bulldozer. It has long been my contention that the human animal is the most dissatisfied creature in the history of the animal kingdom. Give a man a spade, and he will complain that the dirt is too hard. Give him a mule, and he will complain that the beast is too stubborn. Give him a shovel, and he will lament that the task of moving a mountain is a business for a giant, not for a gentleman with a sore back. We are, by nature and by necessity, a species that is perpetually looking for a way to let someone or something else do the heavy lifting. We desire above all else to stand on the peak of a hill and declare that the valley below shall be relocated to the east, provided we do not have to move a single clod of earth ourselves. For the better part of human existence, the alteration of geography was a task reserved for the most ambitious of emperors, the most desperate of slaves, and the most foolish of dreamers. To move a hill required an army of men, a mountain of food, and the sort of absolute, unblinking disregard for human life that usually comes with a crown or a particularly ambitious religious crusade. The shovel and the mule were the engines of change, and they were, it must be admitted, somewhat limited in their output. They worked at the speed of human exhaustion, which is to say quite slowly indeed. But then, in the inexorable march of our mechanical mania, we arrived at the 1920s, a decade that seemed determined to prove that if you put a big enough motor on a piece of iron, you could eventually convince the planet itself to submit to your whims. And thus, there came the bulldozer. The name alone is a masterpiece of linguistic aggression. A bulldozer. It sounds like a creature from a prehistoric swamp, a beast of such sheer indiscriminate power that it would flatten a forest just to clear a path for its own lunch. And in truth, the machine lived up to the name. It was the first true mechanical titan, a piece of industrial hardware that took the simple, ancient, and honestly quite modest concept of the shovel and magnified it until it achieved the status of a planetary nuisance. They took a tractor, that sturdy, plodding, and thoroughly dependable workhorse of the field, and they attached to its front a giant steel blade. It was a simple, brutal, and profoundly effective modification. With the attachment of that blade, the tractor was transformed from a tool of cultivation into an instrument of conquest. No longer was the operator a farmer tending to the needs of the soil. He was a conqueror, a titan, a man who could look at a forest, a swamp, or a stubborn rocky outcrop and decide that it simply did not belong there. The bulldozer did not ask for permission. It did not negotiate. It did not take breaks for the sake of the mule's morale. It simply leaned into the landscape and pushed. It had the relentless, unthinking, and utterly terrifying confidence of a man who has decided that the world is a mistake that needs to be corrected, 1 cubic yard at a time. To watch a bulldozer at work is to witness the absolute, final, and most efficient triumph of the machine over the earth. It is a spectacle of total, unadulterated dominance. The trees fall, the rocks yield, and the hills, which had spent millions of years carving out their own unique place in the world, are smoothed into a flat, sterile, and entirely predictable grade, ready for the next shopping mall or the next stretch of road. We have, in our arrogance, convinced ourselves that this is progress. We call it developing the land. We look at a wild, chaotic, and wonderfully messy piece of nature, and we say, this is not efficient. We look at a hill that is blocking our view, and we say, this is an obstacle. We look at a forest, and we say, this is just a collection of sticks that are getting in the way of the future. And so we turn the key in the ignition, we drop the blade, and we erase the landscape piece by piece, as if the earth were nothing more than a blackboard, and we were the children who had finally been given the eraser. It is a grand, hilarious, and thoroughly terrifying business. We have become the masters of the geography. We have become the architects of the flat. We have created a world where, if you don't like the look of a mountain, you can simply push it into the next county, provided you have the fuel and the ambition to do so. We have rendered the ancient, stubborn, and profoundly beautiful irregularities of the earth into a smooth, gray, and entirely unremarkable surface. We have civilized the hills, which is to say, we have turned them into parking lots. One cannot help but admire the sheer, raw, and unadulterated power of the machine, but one also cannot help but mourn the loss of the hill. There is something fundamentally, deeply, and irredeemably sad about a world that is being flattened by a steel blade. We are losing the edges. We are losing the challenges. We are losing the very things that made the land look like it had been carved by the hand of a master, rather than by the operator of a piece of industrial hardware. We are replacing the mystery with the grid, and we are replacing the wonder with the grade. Of course, the people who operate the machines are, in their own way, quite delighted. They are the new lords of the earth. They are the men who can, with a single lever, alter the world in an afternoon. They are the ones who can look at a forest and, in a few hours of rumbling, clattering, and earth-shaking motion, turn it into a blank, empty space, ready for the next, equally unremarkable structure. They have a sense of accomplishment, I suppose. They have the sense that they are getting things done. And in a world that is obsessed with doing things, that is, I suppose, the only currency that matters. But I wonder, when the bulldozer is finally parked, when the motor has cooled, and when the air has cleared, what is left? A flat, empty, and silent space? A place that has been stripped of its history, its complexity, and its soul. A place that is perfectly efficient, perfectly ready, and perfectly, utterly, and profoundly boring. We have succeeded in making the world a place that we can understand, but in the process, have we made it a place that we still want to live in? The bulldozer is the symbol of our age. It is the machine that says, I will not adapt to the world, I will make the world adapt to me. It is the ultimate expression of the human ego, writ in steel and diesel smoke. It is a miracle of engineering, yes, but it is also a reminder that we are a species that will never be satisfied until the entire planet is as flat, as empty, and as conveniently paved as a driveway. So, let us salute the bulldozer. Let us salute the blade that knows no resistance and the tractor that knows no fatigue. We have finally achieved our goal. We have finally mastered the earth. We have finally made it simple. Now, all that remains is to decide what we are going to do with all this extra space, now that we have successfully removed everything that made it interesting in the first place. I suspect we will simply build more machines so that we can pave even more land, so that we can have even more space to store the machines that we have used to flatten the world. It is a loop, a cycle, a treadmill of the most industrial sort, and as I look out at the landscape, I can't help but think that perhaps a few hills would have been a better investment after all. But then again, I am just a man with a shovel, and nobody ever asks me to grade the road. Perhaps that is for the best. After all, if I were in charge, I might have decided to leave the mountains right where they were. And then where would the progress be? Nowhere. That's where. And we wouldn't want that, would we? Not in this day and age. Not when there is still so much earth that is, quite regrettably, not yet flat. Chapter 20. 1924 is polishing its ledger. It is a curious habit of time that it never seems to acknowledge the exhaustion of the human participant. It marches onward with the mechanical indifference of a drum major who has lost his mind, beating out a tempo that is far too fast for the average man to follow, and showing not the slightest inclination to stop for a smoke or a bit of conversation. As the year 1924 prepares to make its final, slightly ungraceful exit from the stage of history, it is busy polishing its ledger, that vast, messy, and infinitely complex book where all our triumphs and our follies are recorded in ink that never quite seems to dry. Look at the record, if you have the stomach for it. It is a chronicle of a world that is spinning so fast it is beginning to bulge at the middle. We have managed to turn the earth into a playground for the machine, and we are now wondering with a growing sense of unease if perhaps we have allowed the playmates to take over the house. Consider our friend Mr. Coolidge, the man from Vermont, who holds the reins of the Republic with the gripping power of a man holding a wet bar of soap. He is currently occupied with the business of napping, a pursuit he has elevated to a level of executive dignity that would make a sloth weep with envy. He is the perfect president for an age that wants nothing more than to be left alone to pursue its own peculiar, frantic, and entirely unexamined goals. He says nothing, he does very little, and he seems to find the entire spectacle of modern governance to be a tedious, if somewhat necessary, irritation. The nation, in turn, finds him to be a comforting presence, a sort of political security blanket that reminds us that even if the world is going to the dogs, at least there is someone in the White House who isn't going to get in the way of the process. And what of the money? That great, shimmering, and increasingly volatile river that flows through the heart of our commercial life? The German mark, that paper ghost that haunted the dreams of a nation for so long, has been put to rest, replaced by something with a bit more backbone, something that doesn't require a wheelbarrow for the purchase of a sausage. It is a relief, of course, to see the arithmetic finally return to a state of sanity, though one suspects that the trauma of the trillion-mark loaf will be remembered by the next generation with the same sort of grim cautionary respect that we reserve for plagues and tidal waves. But do not look too closely at the stock market. I beg of you, for the sake of your own digestion, look away. It has begun to take on the appearance of an elevator that has forgotten how to go down. It rises, and it rises, and it rises, powered by the collective, breathless, and entirely unearned optimism of a population that has decided that the laws of gravity have been repealed by the sheer force of our own brilliance. Everyone is a financier, you see. The butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker have all become prophets of the ticker tape, convinced that the road to heaven is paved with margin calls, and that the golden age of American prosperity will never, ever come to an end. It is a spectacle of such monumental, hubristic cheer that one can almost hear the sound of the floorboards beginning to groan under the weight of it all. But nobody is listening to the floorboards. They are too busy checking their gains, which is to say, they are too busy counting their dreams before the sun has even thought about setting. The century itself is moving with the velocity of a comet that is being chased by a pack of hungry wolves. We have the radio, we have the film, we have the flying machine, and we have the bulldozer. We have the speed, we have the volume, and we have the illusion that we are finally, at long last, the masters of our own destiny. We are so very proud of ourselves. We look at the past, the dark, slow, and thoroughly misunderstood past, and we laugh at the simplicity of it. We are the new men. We are the men of the modern. We are the men who have arrived, and we have no intention of ever leaving. And yet, there is a haunting quality to the music that still hasn't stopped. It is a jazz tempo, a frantic, syncopated, and utterly unpredictable beat that pulses through the streets of the cities and finds its way into the dreams of the people in the country. It is a music that doesn't promise a resolution. It only promises that the next note will be louder, and perhaps, if we are lucky, a bit more exciting than the last. We are dancing on the edge of a cliff, and we are so busy enjoying the rhythm that we haven't noticed the air is getting thin and the ground is beginning to crumble. It is a grand time to be alive, I suppose. It is a time of immense, terrifying, and thoroughly beautiful possibility. We are a nation that is still in its adolescence, a sprawling, energetic, and entirely headstrong teenager that thinks it knows everything because it has read a few pages of a magazine and learned how to push the start button on a machine. We think we are in control, and that is our greatest, our most endearing, and our most dangerous mistake. As 1924 closes its ledger, it leaves us with a feeling that we are standing in a room full of fireworks, and that someone, we aren't quite sure who, has just lit the fuse. We are waiting for the show, and we are convinced that it will be the most magnificent spectacle the world has ever seen. Perhaps it will be. But one cannot help but notice that there is very little talk of how we are going to handle the smoke once the show is over. We are not interested in the smoke. We are only interested in the sparks. So, let us raise a glass to the year that was and to the year that is to be. Let us celebrate the foolishness, the brilliance, the greed, and the genuine, unvarnished hope that defines us. We are, for better or for worse, the children of this century, and we are bound to its fate as surely as the tide is bound to the moon. We have done our best, or perhaps our worst, and now we must see what the ledger holds in store for us. I suspect it will be a long, loud, and thoroughly confusing record, full of corrections and contradictions that no one will ever truly be able to balance. But that is the way of the world. It never balances. It only accumulates. And as long as we keep the music playing, and as long as we keep the sparks flying, I suppose we can be forgiven for believing that we are the ones who are setting the pace, even when we are merely dancing to a beat that we did not choose and cannot control. The ledger is closed, the ink is dry, and the next volume is waiting, empty and expectant. We have written our piece, and it is a piece that has everything: the comedy, the tragedy, the farce, and the occasional accidental moment of insight. It is our history, and we have done it with all the conviction of a man who is entirely certain that he is the first person in history to have ever truly lived. One can only hope that, when the final page is turned and the ledger is put away, someone will have the good sense to appreciate the sheer, unbridled effort of the performance. But I suspect in the end it will just be another dusty book on a shelf in a library that no one visits, telling a story that everyone has already forgotten. And really, is that not the most honest ending of all? To be a footnote in a history that is already busy writing its next, louder, and even more confusing chapter? I, for one, would not have it any other way. The music is still playing, the floor is still shaking, and I, for one, intend to dance until the very end. It is the only sensible thing to do. Wouldn't you agree? The end. This has been the mechanical Mark Twain.